History is not a straight line. It's not even a road, really. It's more like a book that's been left out in the rain. Most of the pages stuck together, some of them missing entirely, others so faded you can only make out a word or two before the sentence disappears. What we call history is really just what survived. Fragments, scraps, a potsherd here, a half-burned scroll there, a wall with a story carved into it that nobody alive can read anymore. Everything else, the vast majority of what actually happened to actual people, is just gone. Silence. And tonight, that's what we're exploring. Not the parts of history that made it into the textbooks with confident dates and tidy explanations, but the gaps, the stretches of time where the evidence runs thin or vanishes completely, where entire civilizations seem to hold their breath and historians are left squinting at shadows, trying to guess what cast them. Because a gap in history can mean a lot of different things. Sometimes it's literal, records that were written down, then burned or flooded, or eaten by time itself, leaving only rumours of what they once said. Sometimes it's a script we can see perfectly well but simply cannot read. Symbols staring back at us like a locked door with no key. Sometimes an entire society collapses so suddenly and so completely that the cities go quiet, the trade routes go cold, and nobody left behind a note explaining why. And sometimes, honestly, the gap is just us. Sites that haven't been excavated yet, sitting under sand or jungle or someone's backyard. Sources that only tell one side of the story because the other side lost the war or lost the argument or simply never learned to write things down. Over the next while, we're going to drift through some of these gaps together. We'll talk about builders who raised massive stone monuments thousands of years before anyone thought organized society even existed. We'll talk about a Bronze Age world so interconnected it looked almost modern, and then, within a single generation, falling apart everywhere at once. We'll talk about islands and libraries and lost languages and kings whose names we barely know, ruling over cities we're still trying to understand. Now, if you're using this to fall asleep, good. That's exactly what this is for. I'm not here to keep you wired with dramatic music stings and jump cuts. This is meant to be slow, calm, the kind of thing where your eyes get heavy somewhere around the third or fourth topic, and that's completely fine. But even at a whisper, I promise this stays interesting. There's a difference between boring and quiet, and we're aiming for quiet with something worth thinking about underneath it. Before we start, tell me where you're listening from, and what time it is right where you are. I really do read these. Something about knowing it's midnight in Manila while it's still afternoon in Mexico City. All of us drifting off to the same gaps in the same shared human story, that's kind of beautiful to me. Here's how we're going to handle each stop along the way. For every mystery, every silence, every missing chapter, we'll look at what evidence actually exists, however small it might be. We'll talk about where historians and archaeologists disagree, because a lot of this is genuinely disputed, and pretending otherwise wouldn't be honest. And then we'll walk through the leading explanations, the best guesses of people who've spent entire careers staring into these gaps, trying to coax them into giving up their secrets. No absolute answers tonight. Just good questions, gentle pacing, and the strange comfort of realizing that even the biggest, most confident story we tell about human history, the one where everything moves forward in a neat line, is actually full of holes. Holes we're still trying to understand. Let's start at the very edge of what we know. Before cities, before writing, before almost anything we'd recognize as civilization at all. Before we go any further, it's worth pausing on something most people never think about. How do we actually know any of this? When someone tells you a city was destroyed 3,200 years ago? Or that a tool was made 70,000 years before that? Where does that number even come from? It's not written on a plaque. Nobody left a note. So let's slow down for a moment and talk about the detective work itself. Because understanding how the puzzle gets assembled makes the missing pieces so much more interesting. First, why do gaps happen at all? The honest answer is that survival is the exception, not the rule. Wood rots, papyrus crumbles, cloth disintegrates within decades, unless conditions are almost perfectly dry, or perfectly wet, or perfectly frozen. Fire, which built civilizations, also erased them, sweeping through wooden cities and libraries alike. Conquerors sometimes destroyed records on purpose, erasing the memory of the people they replaced. Sometimes it wasn't malice at all, just recycling. Stone from an old temple becomes the wall of a new house. A clay tablet gets soaked and reshaped into something else. And then there's climate, slow and patient, turning fertile plains into desert or burying river valleys under silt. Add a healthy dose of pure chance, whether a particular hillside happened to flood or freeze, or simply never get ploughed by a farmer with no idea what lay 6 feet beneath his field, and you start to understand why what survives is really just a strange, uneven lottery. So how do historians and archaeologists reconstruct anything from what's left? They rely on a toolkit, and it's worth knowing the basics, because you'll hear these terms again and again as we go. There's stratigraphy, the simple but powerful idea that deeper layers of earth are generally older than the ones above them, like pages in a book, if the book had been shuffled a little by floods and rodents and the occasional collapsing wall. There's radiocarbon dating, which measures the decay of a particular carbon isotope in anything that was once alive, giving a rough age with a built-in margin of error. There's dendrochronology, counting tree rings, which can be astonishingly precise for wood that survives, sometimes narrowing a date down to a single year. There are ice cores, drilled from glaciers and polar caps, holding tiny trapped bubbles of ancient atmosphere that record volcanic eruptions, temperature swings, even dust from distant droughts, layer by layer, going back hundreds of thousands of years. And there's comparative typology, the practice of lining up pottery styles or tool shapes from different sites and asking which came first, which technique influenced which, almost like tracing fashion trends across centuries. None of these tools give a perfect answer. They give a range, a probability. Radiocarbon dating doesn't say this happened in the year 1200 BCE. It says there's a 95% chance this happened sometime between 1250 and 1150 BCE, give or take, depending on the sample. Historians live inside these ranges constantly, holding competing models in their heads at the same time, weighing which interpretation fits the most evidence with the fewest assumptions. This is uncomfortable if you want tidy answers, but it's also kind of beautiful, honestly. It's humility built directly into the method. Now, here's something crucial to sit with. The archive we do have is not a random sample of the past. It's heavily tilted toward whoever had the resources to write things down and the luck to have those writings survive. Elite scribes working for kings, urban centres with monumental architecture built to last, literate cultures whose language we can still read. Meanwhile, the vast majority of humanity, farmers, herders, oral cultures, entire peoples who left no writing at all, are almost invisible in the written record, even though they were the majority of humans who ever lived. So when we say we don't have evidence of something, we have to ask, evidence from whom? Recorded by whom? Preserved by whom? This brings us to one of the most important ideas in all of this. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found something doesn't mean it never existed. It might simply mean we haven't dug in the right place yet, or the material didn't survive, or nobody's translated the tablet sitting in a museum basement. So as we move through each of these gaps tonight, I want you to keep one quiet question in the back of your mind. What would it actually take to change our minds? What single discovery, one tablet, one skeleton, one layer of ash could rewrite the story we're about to tell? Because history isn't finished. It's still being uncovered, one fragment at a time. When people talk about lost history, our minds usually jump to vanished cities, burned libraries, missing chronicles. But the biggest gap of all sits long before any of that. It stretches back through the last ice age and then beyond into a span so long our normal sense of time just breaks. Hundreds of thousands of years where humans and human-like beings lived, loved, hunted, raised children, watched the sky, told stories around fires, and almost none of it is recorded in any way we would recognize. Not because they were primitive in the cartoon sense. Not because nothing happened. Mostly because the universe is ruthless about what it keeps. Imagine your own life, reduced to what would survive 100,000 years. Not your phone, not your books, not your clothes. The wood in your house would rot. The metal would corrode. Paper would go to dust. Plastic might linger as trash. But it wouldn't necessarily look like culture. Just strange, degraded lumps. What actually stands a chance? Things hard enough, simple enough, or buried quickly enough to escape the slow grind of oxygen, water, and bacteria. For deep prehistory, that means our entire knowledge is built on a depressingly short list. Stone tools, animal bones with cut marks, bits of human skeletons, charcoal stains from hearths, clumps of mineral pigment like ochre, the occasional preserved footprint in ancient mud. That's the archive for hundreds of thousands, even millions, of years of human experience. And even those rare traces are thinly scattered. Most of the planet has never been systematically surveyed, let alone excavated. Many early sites were on coastlines now drowned by rising seas. Others lie under modern cities, under forests, under fields that have been ploughed and reploughed for millennia. So when you hear that Homo sapiens expanded out of Africa around this date or that one, remember, those timelines are being drawn from a handful of known sites, a few lucky caves, some river terraces where erosion happened to be kind. The result is that deep prehistory looks, at first glance, like a series of faint pinpricks in an ocean of darkness. A flake of worked stone here, a jawbone there, a charcoal lens from an ancient campfire. Archaeologists have become very, very good at squeezing information from those pinpricks. But there are hard limits the method can't cross. You can't carbon date a story. You can't excavate a conversation. You can't put an argument between two people into a museum case. So how do we get from a few stone tools and bones to statements like modern humans were in this region by this time, or symbolic behaviour appears around here? Carefully, and with a lot more debate than the clean narrative usually shows, take migration routes. There's a widespread model that anatomically modern humans left Africa in a major wave around 60 to 70,000 years ago, following coastlines into Arabia, then fanning out toward Asia, Australia and Europe. That model is based on genetics and some key archaeological sites. But every few years, a new find complicates it. A jawbone in Israel that seems older than the supposed big wave. Stone tools in India that some researchers argue show an earlier presence. Footprints in the Americas that, depending on how you interpret the dating, might push back human arrival there by thousands of years. Some specialists argue for multiple earlier dispersals that failed or only partially succeeded. Others urge caution, pointing to uncertainties in dating methods, contamination risks or ambiguous tool styles. The result isn't chaos, but it is fluid. Timelines shift backward or forward as new evidence appears or old evidence gets re-evaluated. Deep prehistory is a moving target. The same is true when we try to talk about minds, not just migrations. At some point, humans began doing things that look recognizably symbolic to us. Painting animals on cave walls, stringing shells into necklaces, burying their dead with care, sometimes with objects that seem to be offerings. These behaviours matter because they hint at inner worlds. You don't need to understand death as we do to dispose of a body, but arranging bones, sprinkling pigment, placing tools or flowers, that suggests meaning. It suggests stories, but even here we're inferring from fragments. Caves with vivid paintings are spectacular, but they're also rare and biased. Rock shelters are more likely to preserve art than open-air wood structures. So we might be seeing the Louvre of the Paleolithic and mistaking it for the average village wall. Burial practices are similarly selective in what they show us. Bodies left on platforms exposed to the elements would often leave no trace at all. If some groups practice cremation without burying the ashes, we'd struggle to see that. What we call the earliest burials may simply be the earliest ones preserved under the right conditions. And then there's the problem of missing complexity, which is maybe the most humbling idea of all. Almost everything humans are really good at, organising into groups, telling stories, building shelters, making tools from flexible materials, depends heavily on things that do not last. Wood, bark, fibres, leather, plant cordage, lightweight boats, sandals, baskets, nets, fitted wooden joints, complex traps, carved totems, even simple musical instruments like flutes or drums. We know late Stone Age people wove textiles, because once in a while we get an imprint in clay, or a miraculous fragment preserved in a bog or a cave. We know they built watercraft capable of crossing deep channels, because people reached Australia and islands in Southeast Asia when sea levels were lower, but still separated by significant stretches of open water. Boats almost certainly existed long before the earliest physical remains we found. Their materials just don't cooperate with 100,000-year timelines. So when you imagine a Paleolithic campsite, the stone tools are the skeleton of that scene, not the full body. The hearth stains are the embers of a much richer life that once burned there. There could have been woven mats on the floor, wooden racks for drying meat, latticework walls, carefully carved wooden figures, nets drying on poles, children's toys, ritual objects, all vanished without a trace. This doesn't mean there were skyscrapers tucked into Ice Age valleys or global electronic networks humming under the glaciers. The physical and energetic constraints of small populations, low surplus, and pre-industrial technology still apply. But it does mean that the line between simple hunter-gatherer camp and complex, symbol-rich community is almost invisible in the archaeological record. We have to be very careful not to assume that absence of durable remains equals absence of social or intellectual sophistication. Some people take that idea and leap all the way to lost high civilizations in deep time, complete with metal, writing, maybe even machines wiped so clean we see nothing. The evidence for that is, at best, extremely thin. If large-scale, dense metal-using societies had existed hundreds of thousands of years ago in numbers comparable to recent civilizations, we'd expect at least some unmistakable traces. Vast mine scars, thick pollution layers, industrial-scale debris. Those simply aren't there. But within the bounds of what small, mobile, pre-agricultural populations can do, there's a huge amount of possible complexity we're probably underestimating. Intricate oral traditions, myth cycles carried for tens of thousands of years, lore and custom encoded in story, detailed ecological knowledge, elaborate ritual systems, sophisticated woodworking and fibre crafts, navigation skills written not on maps but in star patterns, currents and remembered coastlines. All of that could rise, flourish and change beyond recognition without leaving a single artefact we'd recognise in a museum case. So as we move forward toward the more recent gaps, the mysterious cold snap of the younger Dryas, the sudden appearance of monumental sites like Göbekli Tepe, it's worth remembering what lies beneath even those mysteries, an unimaginably long stretch of time where humans were already clever, already symbolic, already telling each other who they were, in ways that mostly dissolved into the soil. By the time our story picks up with a dramatic climate shock at the end of the last ice age, we are not looking at the awakening of a species that had been asleep. We are catching a brief, illuminated moment in a much older, mostly dark room. At the end of the last ice age, the world was supposed to be thawing. Glaciers had been retreating, sea levels rising, ecosystems reshuffling. In many regions, humans had been tracking that slow change for generations, shifting their hunting grounds, experimenting with new foods, watching old patterns of animal movement and plant growth bend in unfamiliar ways. Then, about 12,900 years ago, the trend suddenly snapped. From the perspective of ice and oceans, suddenly still means decades to a couple of centuries, not an afternoon thunderstorm. But in climate terms, the event we call the Younger Dryas was a hard break. Temperatures in the North Atlantic region dropped back toward full glacial conditions. In Greenland ice cores, that shift shows up as a sharp step, chemistry and trapped gas bubbles shifting from warming world back to deep freeze. Those ice cores are one of our main windows into what happened. Layer by layer, year by year, snowfall compacted into ice, capturing tiny samples of the atmosphere. Scientists drill down and pull up cylinders of ancient ice, then rid them like tree rings. Ratios of oxygen and hydrogen isotopes give rough temperature signals. Bubbles preserve old levels of greenhouse gases. Dust, volcanic ash, pollen grains, even microscopic fragments of plants all become proxies, indirect clues to the environment. Around the onset of the Younger Dryas, the record is unmistakable. The isotopes swing cold, dust levels change, suggesting altered wind patterns and dryness. Pollen spectra in lakes and peat bogs shift from trees that like milder conditions back toward tundra and steppe species. In Europe and parts of the Near East, forests that had just begun to return shrank or disappeared, replaced again by more open, colder landscapes. So we know the climate shock was real. What we don't have is a neat single story of how people experienced it. One leading explanation for the Younger Dryas points to the global conveyor belt of ocean circulation. As the great ice sheets melted, fresh water poured into the North Atlantic. Too much fresh water in the wrong place can weaken or redirect the currents that carry warm water north from the tropics. Shut that heat delivery system down or even just slow it, and the regions it used to warm cool rapidly. Many researchers think a big pulse of meltwater from glacial lakes in North America, draining catastrophically into the Atlantic, may have pushed the system past some tipping point. Others argue for more gradual changes, or for a more complex chain of causes that we haven't fully pinned down. There are also more dramatic hypotheses. Some propose that fragments of a comet or asteroid exploded in the atmosphere and triggered widespread burning, lofting soot and dust that disrupted climate. The so-called Younger Dryas impact hypothesis points to layers of unusual materials at some sites, microscopic spheres, certain forms of carbon, hints of intense heating as possible evidence. But here the debates become fierce. Many specialists counter that the evidence for an impact is inconsistent, that similar materials can be produced by normal processes, and that we don't see a clear global layer that screams cosmic catastrophe, the way the one at the end of the Age of Dinosaurs does. At this point, the impact idea is very much contested, not a consensus. What everyone mostly agrees on is simpler. However the switch flipped, the climate lurched back toward cold, at a moment when humans in some regions were starting to live differently than their Ice Age ancestors. In the Levant, the region that includes modern Israel, Jordan, Lebanon and surrounding areas, People of the Natufian culture had begun doing something unusual for hunter-gatherers. Even before farming, they were experimenting with semi-settled life. We see stone-built houses clustered into small villages, cemeteries with repeated burials, heavy grinding stones for processing grains, all of it hinting at groups staying put for much of the year. They were intensively harvesting wild cereals and other plants in landscapes that, during the initial warming, had become relatively rich. You can picture hills with patches of wild barley and wheat, stands of nuts and fruit trees, herds of gazelle, a place where the effort of returning to the same camp, investing in more permanent structures, might start to feel worthwhile. Then the younger Dryas arrives and the environment tilts. In some areas, those semi-sedentary settlements are abandoned or shrink. In others, people seem to double down on new strategies, cultivating favoured plants, storing more food, tightening their territories. Archaeologists debate exactly how direct the connection is between the climate shock and the later emergence of full-scale agriculture, but the timing is suggestive. A harsher, more erratic world may have nudged groups from "let's harvest what grows here" toward "let's make sure it grows here." Elsewhere, the same climate event played out through different human stories. In Europe, late Ice Age hunter-gatherer groups were already mobile specialists, tracking herds across large ranges. The return to colder conditions likely shifted which species dominated and where they could be found. Some cave sites and open-air camps that had been used during the preceding warm phase fall out of use. New ones appear in different zones. In North America, the Younger Dryas overlaps with the period when many of the continent's large animals, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, were disappearing. The exact roles of climate stress and human hunting in those extinctions remain deeply debated, but either way, the ecological playing field was being rearranged just as people were spreading into new territories and experimenting with varied tool traditions. What we see on the ground in the dirt is a patchwork of abrupt and gradual. In some excavation profiles, there's a clear boundary, a layer rich with one type of stone tool, one kind of animal bone, one style of hearth, capped by a different suite of artifacts and remains. It can look like a curtain dropping between one way of life and another. But those sharp lines in sediment can flatten the real experience of change. A sudden break in an archaeological layer might compress 300 years of slow adjustment, conflict and compromise. A village might have been reoccupied 5 times, with houses rebuilt in slightly different places, each leaving only a smear of debris. Families might have argued each season over whether to stay or leave, whether to keep planting or go back to full-time hunting. None of that nuance shows up as a neat, separate stripe in the soil. Climate shifts like the Younger Dryas don't just move temperature graphs. They move people, they push hunting grounds uphill or downhill, make old migration routes risky, alter where plants can be found, collapse some resource zones while opening others. When that happens, 3 big processes usually follow, and all of them leave messy, ambiguous traces: migration, conflict, and adaptation. Some groups likely packed up and followed the climate, edging toward coasts, rivers, or refuges where conditions stayed milder. Others defended the best patches of land more fiercely, or tried to negotiate access through ritual, marriage, and alliance. Still others retooled their subsistence strategies: new prey species, more fishing, more plant use, more storage, tentative steps toward managing landscapes, rather than just harvesting them. We can see hints of all this, shifts in where sites cluster, changes in tool types, new use of grinding stones or storage pits, but the human motives remain blurry. Were people driven out by starvation, drawn in by opportunity, forced into contact with strangers who spoke different languages and told different origin myths. The younger Dryas sits right at a hinge in human history, between the long, deep rhythms of Ice Age life and the first stirrings of settled villages, cultivation, and eventually cities. We can trace the climate curve with icy precision. We can map pollen changes in lakes and count seeds in hearth ash. But the most important part, the arguments around fires, the fears and hopes as weather patterns shifted, the stories people told to explain why the world had turned cold again, that part is missing. All we see are the after images: abandoned camps, altered diets, new ways of living just beginning to take shape. Out of that cold, unstable interval, something unexpected emerged. In certain places, instead of simply moving on, people stayed. They built, gathered, and, for reasons we still don't fully grasp, began to raise stones. On a low, unassuming hill in southeastern Turkey, those stones are still standing. Today we call the place Göbekli Tepe, Potbelly Hill. For a long time, locals knew it as just that, a rounded rise above the surrounding plains. Farmers ploughed its flanks, shepherds grazed their flocks nearby. No one realized that beneath the soil was one of the most startling sights in all of prehistory. When archaeologists began to excavate in the 1990s, they uncovered something that did not belong to the world we thought we understood: massive T-shaped limestone pillars, some weighing 10, 20, even 40 tons, arranged in circular or oval enclosures, two especially tall pillars standing in the centre of each circle, facing one another like silent figures frozen in conversation. The stone's surfaces carved with reliefs, foxes slinking along the edges, snarling lions, wild boar, snakes, birds, scorpions, abstract signs that we still can't quite read. Many of the T-pillars themselves aren't just supports. They seem to be stylized human forms, some bare arms bent at the elbows, hands clasped at the front. On a few you can make out belts and loincloths. These are not random rocks. They are sculpted beings. And then comes the part that makes archaeologists stare at the radiocarbon dates, shake their heads and check again. Göbekli Tepe is old. The earliest levels we've dated go back to around 9600 BCE, maybe a bit earlier. That's roughly 11,500 years ago. Long before the pyramids, long before Stonehenge, long before writing or bronze or cities in Mesopotamia. In fact, it's older than the conventional start of farming in the region. For decades, a simple story dominated our understanding of how complex societies formed. First, the model went, people settled down to farm. Farming created food surpluses. Surpluses allowed population growth, specialists, leaders, priests. Only then, with fields and villages and hierarchy in place, could you get the time, labour and organisation needed for big monuments and elaborate temples. Göbekli Tepe does not sit comfortably in that story. When the earliest enclosures were built, the people using this hill were, as far as we can tell, still hunter-gatherers. We don't find house foundations all over the mound, the way we do at later Neolithic villages. We don't see clear evidence of domesticated wheat or barley or herded sheep in the deepest levels. The stone tools and animal bones look like the toolkit and prey of mobile foragers: gazelle, wild cattle onagers, wild pigs. Yet those same people were quarrying and shaping multi-ton stones, hauling them hundreds of meters uphill, arranging them in careful circles, and covering them with skilled symbol-rich carvings. It flips the old sequence on its head. Here, it seems, are monuments before cities, ritual architecture before permanent domestic architecture, a place of gathering, ceremony, and possibly myth, existing in a world where most people still moved across the landscape with the seasons. So what was Göbekli Tepe for? We have no texts. No inscriptions telling us, This is the temple of such and such god. No dedicatory plaque with the builder's name and date. All we have is stone, bone, soil, and pattern. One widely discussed idea is that the hill was a ritual centre, a kind of pilgrimage site. Groups from a wide region might have converged here at certain times of year. The enclosures with their towering central pillars may have represented beings, ancestors, spirits or deities, presiding over ceremonies whose details we can't reconstruct. Another line of thinking sees Göbekli Tepe as a hub for seasonal gatherings. Mobile bands might have come together during particular windows, perhaps coinciding with animal migrations or ripening wild grains. They could feast, exchange goods, arrange marriages, settle disputes, renew alliances, and take part in rituals that reaffirmed shared identities. In this view, the huge communal labour of carving and raising stones isn't a side effect, it's the point. Building something so massive becomes a way to bind scattered groups together. You show up, you work, you participate in ceremonies under the watchful gaze of the carved animals and pillar beings, and you leave with a reinforced sense of who we are. Some researchers push the argument one step further and suggest that places like Göbekli Tepe didn't just follow agriculture, they may have helped cause it. The idea goes like this. If you're going to host large, regular gatherings of people, you need a lot of food in predictable quantities. Wild resources can be rich but unreliable, so perhaps the social obligation to feed big feasts nudged people toward managing stands of wild cereals, tending certain patches, gradually stepping into cultivation, and, eventually, full domestication. It's a compelling story, but it's still a hypothesis. The timing of plant domestication in the region, the exact dates of different enclosures, and the scale of gatherings are all active research questions. We should be cautious about flipping the old narrative into a new, equally rigid one. What we can say with more confidence is what we don't know. We don't know the names or languages of the people who built Göbekli Tepe. We don't know how many separate groups were involved, how power was structured, whether there were formal priests or simply elders and specialists recognized for their knowledge. We don't know what myths they told about the animals carved into the stones or what the abstract symbols meant to them. We don't yet fully understand how their daily lives were organized. Did they live in small camps scattered across the nearby valleys and only come here for short bursts? Were there semi-permanent settlements just beyond the parts of the hill we've excavated so far? How did they coordinate the labour to quarry, shape, and raise each pillar? Was participation voluntary, religiously compelled, socially pressured? Even the site's end is a kind of riddle. Over time, the earliest and most monumental enclosures were deliberately buried. People filled them in with debris, broken stone, animal bones, everyday refuse. This wasn't a natural landslide. It looks intentional. New, smaller structures were built higher up, while the older, grander circles remained entombed below. Why? One possibility is ritual closure. Perhaps, after generations, certain enclosures were symbolically retired. Filling them in could have been part of a ceremony that ended their use while preserving them as sacred underworld spaces, never to be casually walked over or dismantled. Another is social change. Maybe beliefs shifted, leadership changed, or new groups took control. Deliberately burying the old monuments could have been a way to put the past to rest and assert a new order, or to manage tensions by neutralizing earlier sacred spaces. It could also be practical and symbolic at once. Backfilling an old, unstable structure stabilizes the mound and creates a platform for newer buildings, while also enacting a story about renewal and transformation. We don't have enough evidence to choose one interpretation with certainty, and Göbekli Tepe is no longer alone. ongoing work in the same region has revealed other early monumental and semi-monumental sites. Places like Karahan Tepe and other members of what some archaeologists call the Tash Tepala group, the Stone Hills. They share architectural and artistic themes: T-shaped pillars, carved animals, special enclosures separate from ordinary living spaces. Farther afield in different times and places, we see other examples of hunter-gatherers or early farmers investing in large communal constructions, earthworks, mounds, stone alignments. The pattern hints that our earlier, simpler models, no monuments without agriculture, no complex ritual without settled villages, were at best partial truths. So we need to be careful about making Göbekli Tepe carry more weight than it can bear. It is extraordinary, but it is also one data point within a patchy record that is still being filled in. Treating it as a single magic key that unlocks the whole story of civilization risks repeating the same mistake we made with older narratives, forcing a linear script onto a much messier reality. What Göbekli Tepe really gives us is a sense of vertigo. Standing at the edge of its story, we realize that the urge to gather, to carve symbols into stone, to build places where the human and the more than human meet, that urge may be older and more foundational than our neat categories of village, farm, and city allow. And yet, after all those stones were raised and buried, there is still a long silence before the first clear cities appear. Between the hunters who carved foxes on T-pillars and the scribes who pressed wedge-shaped marks into clay, whole chapters are missing. To find the first cities, we have to move forward several thousand years to the river plains of Mesopotamia, where people finally begin to leave us not just stones and bones, but something tantalizingly close to their own words, and then lose most of them again. Down in the lowlands between the Tigris and Euphrates, the story changes texture. For the first time, we can see not just what people built, but what they counted. The earliest writing in Mesopotamia does not look like literature. It does not look like laws carved in stone or epic poems about angry gods and brave kings. It looks like math, little impressed marks on wet clay, columns of numbers, lists of grain, sheep, beer rations, names and quantities, debits and credits. Before anyone wrote down a myth, they wrote down who owed whom, how much barley. For thousands of years, people in these river plains had been experimenting with agriculture, irrigation, and denser settlement. Villages grew, fields expanded, temples rose. With more people and more food came more complexity, workers to pay, land to track, offerings to record. At some point, probably in the late 4th millennium BCE, someone made the leap. Instead of trusting memory and spoken promises, let the clay remember. They started with tokens, small clay counters representing sheep, jars of oil, measures of grain. Then they began pressing those tokens into clay balls, sealing them up as a kind of contract. Eventually they realized you didn't need the tokens themselves. You could just impress their shapes into a flat tablet. That's the birth of cuneiform, not as a script for beautiful stories, but as accounting. And this is where our frustration begins, because almost all of that early paperwork is gone. Clay, by itself, is surprisingly durable, but these tablets were small, everyday objects. Many were never fired. They just dried in the sun. In a damp environment, a single flood, a collapsed roof, a centuries-long pause in occupation can reduce unfired clay to mud again. Most of the tablets that survived did so by accident, burned in building fires that hardened them like pottery. Entire archives owe their preservation to disasters. So when we look at the earliest cities, places like Uruk and the proto-urban layers of Eridu, we're seeing a tiny biased sample of all the writing that once existed. We have enough to know that people were keeping records, grain yields, livestock tallies, labour assignments, temple inventories. We have hints of personal names and offices, but there are probably orders of magnitude more tablets that turned back into riverbank silt long ago. Alongside the tablets, we find something else. Cylinder seals. These are small carved cylinders of stone, no bigger than a thumb. When you roll one across soft clay, it leaves a continuous image. Rows of animals, processions of humans, strange hybrid beings, swirling patterns of plants and symbols. In an administrative world, the seal is a signature. You roll your unique pattern over a tablet or a jar stopper to say, "This is authorized. This is mine. This has been accounted for." To archaeologists today, cylinder seals feel like a strange hybrid of stamp, ID badge, and art gallery. Their images are vivid. You see figures leading animals, worshippers in front of altars, a person in a horned headdress receiving offerings. You see motifs that later appear in fully developed myth: gods with wings, lions beneath thrones, the tree of life. But there is a limit to what they tell us. They can show us symbols and scenes, suggest a world of ritual and hierarchy, but they almost never name names. A seal doesn't say, "I am N, something manager of such and such district, in the 3rd year of King so-and-so." It just rolls out its silent parade of images. So we know there were offices, roles, and maybe early kings or temple leaders. We just don't know exactly how their power was structured, or what they called themselves. When we dig into these cities, the ground itself has gaps. Archaeological layers don't stack up neatly like pages in a book. Between one level of occupation and the next, there can be centuries of erosion, flooding, or simply no building in that exact spot. When we excavate, we might jump from a late Uruk temple floor to a much later rebuilding phase with nothing in between, not because nothing happened, but because later activity scraped away everything that recorded it. This is especially true in floodplains. The rivers that nourished Mesopotamia also rewrote it. Floods washed away houses, smeared layers together, and forced people to rebuild. Each new temple or palace often went up right on top of the old one, its foundations cutting into earlier levels, its bricks reusing older material. Over 5,000 years, a site like Uruk or becomes a layer cake of construction and destruction. Deep foundations for a later ziggurat slice through earlier walls and floors. Later builders haul bricks from abandoned structures, taking inscriptions and tablets with them, grinding the written past back into building material. Meanwhile, above the soil, scribes were trying to impose order on memory. Much later, when Mesopotamian scholars compiled dynastic lists, long chronicles of rulers and reign lengths, they tried to reach back to the beginnings of kingship. They wrote about antediluvian kings who reigned for impossibly long spans, tens of thousands of years each, ruling cities whose earliest archaeological traces are modest at best. These lists have names, cities, and a great dividing line, a great flood. Then the flood swept over, and after the flood kingship descended again from heaven. It is tempting to take that literally and go hunting in the mud for a single world-shattering deluge. In reality, the landscape remembers many floods, regional, devastating, scattered across centuries. At some sites, we see thick layers of river-laid silts separating older and younger occupations. At others, the flood layers are thin or absent. Myths remember pattern, not detail. The story of a singular, moralized flood may be an echo of generations living with recurring inundations that wiped out fields and towns, resetting political orders over and over. The dynastic lists, too, are part history, part literary project. Their early sections stretch reign lengths into the fantastic. Kings become semi-divine. Chronology blurs into theology. When we compare these texts to the archaeological layers, They don't line up cleanly. Some named rulers vanish from the dirt entirely. Some cities rise in the spade before they rise in the lists. Gaps open up centuries wide, where the written tradition is silent or contradictory. And beneath all of this lies a political fog. Were the earliest cities ruled by temple priests, by councils of elders, by warrior kings? Different scholars emphasize different models. In some periods, the temple seems central, managing land and labour. In others, royal inscriptions speak of kings who subdue cities and establish justice. But our strongest royal texts come from periods when writing is already mature and propaganda is in full swing. For the very first urban generations, we mostly have their ledgers, not their constitutions. We infer the shape of their politics from grain rations and brick stamps, from the footprint of walls and the size of public buildings. It's like trying to reconstruct a modern state from its supermarket receipts and warehouse blueprints. From Göbekli Tepe's carved animals to Uruk's counted sheep and beer, we can see a trajectory. Gatherings become settlements, settlements become cities, ritual and ration books intertwine. Yet even here, in one of the best studied birthplaces of urban life, the paper trail is mostly missing. Clay dissolved, archives burned, and were not fired hard enough to survive. Floods smeared one chapter into the next. Myths remembered floods and kings but rearranged them into stories that made sense to later audiences. So when we say the first cities, we're looking at scattered lights in a much larger darkness. The streets are mostly gone, the chatter of the markets is silent. We have a few surviving tablets, seals and walls, and a lot of guesswork. And Mesopotamia is, in some ways, the lucky case. Elsewhere, we have entire literate worlds whose scripts we still can't even read, civilizations that left us libraries of signs and yet remain stubbornly mute. Northwest, along another great river, the story feels like it should be clearer. Egypt gives the impression of continuity. For more than 2,000 years, kings carved their names deep into stone. Pyramids rise out of the desert. Temple walls are covered with hieroglyphs. In the later periods, we have lists of rulers, dated inscriptions, astronomical references that can be pinned to actual sky events. So you might expect the very beginning to be neatly mapped out. Instead, when you go back toward the earliest dynasties, the picture dissolves. On paper it looks simple. There's a neat sequence. Dynasty 1, Dynasty 2, Dynasty 3, kings with orderly names, reigning one after another. Later Egyptian priests like Manetho in the 3rd century BCE even grouped them into dynasties for us and assigned reign lengths. But those lists were put together 2,000 years after the supposed first kings lived. They were working with their own sources, their own gaps, their own political and religious agendas. They were also comfortable smoothing over awkward transitions, merging parallel lineages, tidying everything into a single divinely guided story of kingship along the Nile. When we step away from the later lists and look at the ground and the carbon dates, the order is not so tidy. Our main evidence for the early dynastic period comes in a few flavours. There are king lists carved on stone in later temples, like the Abydos list in Seti's Hall, where pharaohs are shown reciting the names of their royal ancestors. These lists skip rulers who were inconvenient, contested, or remembered as heretics. They smooth out times when 2 or more kings might have ruled different parts of Egypt at once. They present a cleaned-up lineage, not a raw chronicle. Then there are the earliest inscriptions themselves, tiny labels of ivory and wood, seal impressions on jar stoppers, rock graffito in remote desert wadis, damaged dedicatory texts in early tombs. Names appear in these fragments: Nama, Aha, Jir, Den, but often without clear dates or context beyond a vague year of such and such event. We have tombs, especially at sites like Abydos and Saqqara. Large, elaborate mastabas and underground chambers lined with offerings and grave goods. Archaeologists can sequence these burials relative to each other. This tomb cuts into that one. This style of pottery comes after that one. But turning a sequence of burials into an absolute calendar, how many years, which exact decades, requires something more. That's where radiocarbon dating and other cross-checks come in. Organic materials in tombs, wooden coffins, reed mats, linen wrappings can be sampled and dated. Those dates are then compared to the traditional king lists and sequences of regnal years noted on objects. Scholars build statistical models trying to align the relative order of rulers with radiocarbon ranges. The result is not a single clean timeline, but a bundle of probability curves. Depending on how you weight the evidence, Dynasty 1 might start a few decades earlier or later. The reign lengths of individual kings can stretch or shrink. In some models, there's overlap between rulers once thought strictly sequential, hinting at possible co-regencies or rival claimants. And all the while, gaps open up in the record, not because nothing happened, but because the evidence didn't survive. Early royal tombs and temples were quarried in later times. Fine limestone blocks were cut out and hauled off to build new monuments. When a later king expanded his own mortuary complex, he might strip older structures down to their foundations. In the process, inscriptions disappeared, statues were smashed or recarved, and dedicatory texts were reduced to anonymous fill. Looting isn't only a modern problem. Ancient robbers tunnelled into royal tombs to steal metals and precious stones. To reach the burial chambers, they hacked through walls, shifted blocks, knocked over stelae. Centuries later, when archaeologists arrive, they find a space that has been opened, looted, reused, and collapsed more than once. Even when a monument survives, its story can be selective. Royal inscriptions emphasize battles won, enemies smitten, temples endowed. They rarely mention failed campaigns, civil wars, or the name of the rival whose monuments you just erased. When a new dynasty takes power, it may literally carve its name over an earlier king's, rewriting history in hieroglyphs. This is part of why political unification in Egypt feels hazy. Schoolbook versions tell a bold, simple story. Upper Egypt conquers Lower Egypt under a single king, often identified with Narmer or Menes, and the two lands are united once and for all. The material record suggests a slower, more uneven process. Before the first dynasty, we see powerful regional centres. Nakada in Upper Egypt, Hierakonpolis, with its impressive temples and elite burials, Buto and other sites in the delta. Artifacts show local elites adopting similar symbols, crowns, sceptres, animal motifs, but there is also regional variation. Some scholars see this as a patchwork of competing chiefdoms, gradually stitched together through marriage, conquest, and shared ritual. The famous Narmer palette, with its king wearing both the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt, might not be a photograph of a single historical event. It might be a commemorative statement of ideal unity, crafted after the fact. The reality on the ground could have been decades of shifting alliances, uprisings, breakaway regions, and partial control. Even the question, who was the first king, is contested. Was it Narmer, whose name appears on ceremonial objects and ceilings? Was it an earlier figure like Scorpion II, known from a single enigmatic mace head? Or do we draw the line somewhere in the dense lowlands of pre-dynastic chiefs whose names we barely know? As for the people living under these early rulers, their lives are mostly inferred from the edges of royal projects. We can see the outlines of labour in the massive tomb complexes, Stone blocks quarried and dragged, bricks moulded and fired, subsidiary burials arranged around the main royal grave. We find tools, grain silos, town walls, simple house plans. But we don't have diaries from the workers who baked bread for the royal crews, or letters from farmers upstream complaining about corvée labour. The earliest personal documents appear centuries later. Until then, everyday life is reconstructed from pottery types, ware on grinding stones, the bones of butchered animals. How often did famines strike in those first centuries of kingship? How did villagers feel about the new ideology of a god-king? Did different regions resist more than others? The royal record is quiet on these questions. And then, once in a while, a new find jolts the whole framework. A previously unknown tomb appears at Abydos, with seal impressions naming a king in a place on the sequence we thought was empty. A cache of inscribed labels turns up, referring to building projects in years that don't fit neatly into standard reign lengths. New radiocarbon samples push a ruler's accession date back by a few decades, forcing a rethinking of who could have interacted with whom, because the early dynastic period sits at a crossroads, between prehistory and history, between local chiefs and full pharaohs. Small adjustments ripple outward, shift one king's reign, and the date of a neighbouring region's imports changes. Move the start of unification 50 years, and its relationship to climate shifts or Nile flood patterns has to be reconsidered. A single new inscription, pulled from the sand, can strip the neat certainty from textbook timelines and replace it with branching possibilities. So even in Egypt, land of stone monuments and carved names, the first centuries of kingship play out in half-light. We have enough to outline a story, local powers rising, symbols of kingship spreading, a gradual knitting together of the river valley under rulers who claim to embody cosmic order. But much of what we imagine about that transformation, the arguments in palace courtyards, the compromises in border towns, the daily adjustments of farmers and craftsmen, remains invisible. The Nile flowed, fields were sown and harvested, people lived and died, watched new crowns appear on distant horizons, heard news in the marketplace of battles won or lost. The kings carved their names into stone. Time and other kings carved many of those names back out again. Farther east along another river system, the ruins feel even more orderly, and the story is somehow even harder to tell. On the plains of what is now Pakistan and northwest India, two cities stand out in the archaeological record like ghosts of a world that should be familiar: Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro. They do not look like chaotic, slowly accreted towns. Street grids run at right angles, laid out with a planner's eye. Houses line these streets with a striking regularity, multi-room brick dwellings, often with internal courtyards, sometimes 2 or even 3 stories high. Many have private bathing areas and drains that connect to covered sewage channels running under the streets. Those drains slope with careful precision. Across whole neighbourhoods, waste water flowed away from houses into larger conduits. Wells are everywhere, tens of thousands across the civilization, so that many families had access to their own water source. There are no pyramids or enormous royal statues here. No single towering palace dominates the horizon, but the whole urban fabric quietly insists on coordination. Standardized baked bricks of consistent proportions, granaries and platforms that suggest centralized storage, weights and measures that match across cities hundreds of kilometers apart. By around 2600 BCE, the Indus or Harappan civilization is flourishing. Its cities stretch from the highlands near Afghanistan down to the Arabian Sea and eastward toward the Ganges Plain. Its merchants are turning up in Mesopotamian records as Meluha traders, bringing wood, ivory, beads, and possibly cotton. and on seals, pottery, tools, and small tablets, a compact, tantalizing script appears. Tiny rectangular seals carved from stetite show animals, unicorn-like beasts, bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and above them, lines of signs. The signs are crisp, repeated in consistent patterns, clearly not random doodles. They look like writing. They behave like writing. They sit where you'd expect writing to sit. Near ownership marks, on ceilings that might have closed packages, on objects that may have moved through administrative hands. But we can't read a single word. The Indus script problem sits at the heart of our ignorance about this civilization. Almost all the inscriptions are short, most are 4 to 5 signs long, some a little longer, rarely more than 20. There are no long narrative stellae, no multi-line letters, no bilingual texts conveniently pairing Indus signs with a known language like the Rosetta Stone did for Egyptian hieroglyphs. When you have tiny strings of symbols, pattern finding is possible. You can spot sign orders that behave like prefixes or suffixes. You can see signs that often appear together and others that rarely do. Computational linguists have run statistical tests and argued that the distribution of Indus signs looks more like language than random marks. But what kind of language system is it? Here, the debate opens up. Some scholars argue the Indus script is a full writing system, encoding speech, possibly a Dravidian language, distantly related to modern Tamil, Kannada, and others in southern India. They point to recurring sign sequences, apparent name like formulas on seals and structural parallels to other early scripts. Others are more cautious. They suggest we might be looking at something like a symbol code for names, clans, or titles, a set of emblematic marks that identify people and institutions without recording full sentences. Think more along the lines of heraldic badges, trademarks, or shorthand labels, not full prose. There are even proposals that the signs functioned partly like religious or cosmological symbols, dense with meaning for insiders, but not necessarily mapping neatly onto spoken words in the way an alphabet does. Without a bilingual key, and without longer texts where context can push you toward one interpretation or another, certainty stays out of reach. And that uncertainty ripples outward. Mesopotamia leaves us royal boasts. Egypt leaves us tomb autobiographies and religious texts. We can, however imperfectly, listen in on how those societies describe their own histories. The Indus world leaves us almost nothing we can hear. We don't know what its people called their cities or how they named their rulers, if they had rulers in the way we imagine. We don't have law codes, myths, royal annals, or temple hymns. We don't even know how they divided time or what they thought about death. So when the cities begin to change, the silence becomes oppressive. Around 1900 BCE, signs of stress appear. Some sites show evidence of flooding, layers of silt over earlier occupation. Others shrink in size. Standardized brick proportions become less rigid. Long-distance trade, once vibrant, seems to falter. The distinctive Indus seals become rare in Mesopotamian layers. It is tempting to look for a single dramatic cause, a conquest, a catastrophic invasion, a massive war. The material record doesn't really support that neat story. Fortification walls do exist, but there is little clear evidence of sacked cities, burned palaces, or mass graves associated with violent destruction at the civilization's peak. Metal weapons are found, but not in the kind of concentrations that scream of large, organized armies storming through. Instead, archaeologists point to a cluster of more gradual, overlapping pressures. Rivers that once nourished major settlements appear to have shifted course. The Gagahakra, often associated with the later Saraswati of Indian tradition, seems to have lost its perennial flow. When a river migrates or dries, Cities built on its banks face hard choices, invest enormous labour into new irrigation systems, move or slowly decline. At the same time, climate data from lake sediments and other proxies suggest changes toward drier conditions in parts of the region. Cropping patterns may have had to adjust, yields might have become less reliable. Trade networks that once tied together Afghanistan's highlands, the Indus plains, and the Gulf coasts could have frayed under the strain. In some models, power doesn't so much collapse as diffuse. Large, meticulously planned urban centres give way to smaller towns and village-level settlements. The standardized urban culture of the mature Harappan period fragments into more localized traditions. Craft production continues, but on a different scale and with more regional variation. People don't vanish, they reorganize. All of this is plausible. Bits of it are well supported. But the narrative never quite sharpens, because we are missing the voices of the people living through it. We don't have letters from merchants complaining that river transport has become unreliable. No royal edicts about shifting fields or relocating warehouses. No treaties marking the end of a shared system of standards. If there was political decentralization, city councils losing authority, local elites rising, regional loyalties eclipsing a broader Indus identity, we see it only indirectly in the scatter of bricks and pottery. What we do have in abundance is material culture, carefully drilled carnelian beads, made with techniques that require extraordinary patience and skill. Tiny faience figurines and amulets, board games and gaming pieces that hint at leisure and shared rules. Evidence of cotton textiles, the earliest known in the world, suggesting specialized agriculture and weaving. We have those standardized weights, tiny stone cubes and rounded pieces, calibrated to a shared system, implying trade and accounting sophisticated enough to care deeply about precise quantities. We have the city layouts themselves whispering of civic planning, drainage committees, and whoever decided that this neighbourhood would get this width of street and that alignment of houses. Even without readable texts, patterns emerge. It looks like a society in which many urban households had access to water management and bathing facilities, not just a palace elite. A world with far fewer clear displays of deep social stratification than we see in Egypt or Mesopotamia at the same time, though how far we can push that inference is debated. It looks like a civilization that poured its complexity into infrastructure, craft and order, rather than into towering monuments and long inscriptions. And it looks like one whose own story, its founding myths, its arguments, its last days as a network of great cities, is locked behind a curtain of signs we recognize as meaningful, but cannot yet unlock. Somewhere in those tiny lines of script, repeated over and over on seals and tablets, are the words they used for themselves, for their gods, for their river, for the changes they felt coming. For now we move through their streets in our minds, hearing only the sound of water running under brick, drains sloping gently away into the dark. Farther west, in the bright island light of the Aegean, the ruins feel very different. Not brick grids and quiet drains, but terraces and staircases, light wells and painted walls. A civilization that seems to have poured its energy into movement, colour, and the sea. On Crete, by around 2000 BCE, great palace complexes rise at places we now call Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, Zakros. Palace is our word, theirs, if they had one, is locked away. These are not just royal residences, they are storage centres, workshop hubs, ritual spaces, administrative hearts. Courtyards sit at their centres, long and rectangular, aligned with the sun. Around them, multi-storey buildings step and fold with corridors that twist and suddenly open, with columns that taper the wrong way, thicker at the top, thinner at the base. Magazines, long rooms lined with huge storage jars, run like underground ribs through the complexes, once filled with oil, grain, wine, and other goods. Everywhere there are signs of connectivity. Cretan pottery turns up across the Aegean. Fine painted cups and jugs, marine-style vases covered with octopuses and shells and swirling plant forms show up on faraway shores. In return, precious metals, raw materials, and exotic items flow back. Ship frescoes and small boat models hint at fleets of wooden vessels plying the sea lanes. Later Greek writers will imagine these Cretan seafarers as the people of Minos, masters of a thalassocracy, a sea power that kept pirates at bay and dominated the islands. Whether that exact political structure existed is uncertain, but the archaeology supports a world in which Crete is anything but isolated. And like the Indus, the Minoans, as we call them, leave behind a script we can see but not hear. On clay tablets, on seal stones, sometimes on pottery, a set of signs appears in neat rows. This is Linear A, named because its forms are more line-based than the pictorial hieroglyphic signs that also appear on some early Cretan artifacts. It clearly behaves like a writing system with rules. Signs repeat in patterns. Certain symbol clusters show up where you'd expect numbers or commodities in accounting contexts. There are separate numerical marks. Tablets are often found in storerooms and archive rooms, sometimes baked accidentally when buildings burned. It looks like palace bookkeeping, rations, goods in and out, maybe lists of people or offerings. In structure, Linear A resembles later Linear B, the script used on Mycenaean Greek tablets a few centuries afterward. Many of the signs are visually similar or even identical, so we did what seems natural. Once Linear B was deciphered in the 1950s and shown to encode an early form of Greek, scholars tried to apply the same sound values back onto Linear A. It was a hopeful move, but it doesn't quite work. The sign sequences in Linear A, when read with Linear B phonetic values, do not produce understandable Greek or any other known language. Some words may be place names that carried over into later periods. A few sign groups might match with known Cretan toponyms, but the core language behind Linear A remains unidentified. It doesn't clearly fit Indo-European. It doesn't clearly fit Semitic. It might be a language isolate, or something related to other now-vanished tongues of the Eastern Mediterranean. And so, just as with the Indus script, the most basic questions remain unanswered. We don't know what the Cretans called themselves. We don't know the names of their rulers, if they had kings, queens, councils, or something less centralized. We don't know their laws, their myths, their prayers. Their economic system is visible as quantities and containers and distribution patterns, but silent about how people talked about obligation, tax, gift, or debt. Their religion is visible in figurines and shrines, but its stories, its doctrines, if it had any, do not reach us in words. Instead, we are left with images and layers of ash. To the north of Crete lies the island of Thera, modern Santorini. In the middle of the second millennium BCE, it explodes. The exact date is still debated, with radiocarbon samples, ice cores, tree rings and historical chronologies pushing scholars back and forth. Somewhere around the 1600s BCE, give or take a few decades, the volcanic island tears itself apart. At Akrotiri, a town on Thera preserved under meters of pumice and ash, we see a snapshot of an Aegean world that looks, in many ways, Minoan. Multi-story houses with wall paintings showing ships, festivals, landscapes, imported Cretan pottery, indoor plumbing with pipes, storage pithoi, weaving equipment, and all the paraphernalia of an active trading settlement. The people had time to leave before the final burial. Doors are open, valuables taken, bodies are absent. Then it ends. The ash falls. The sea rushes in, a caldera forms where much of the island used to be. How did this event affect Crete and its palaces? Here we enter one of the great debates of Bronze Age archaeology. One model sees Thera's eruption as a civilization-ending blow. Massive tsunamis race south, smashing into the north coast of Crete, destroying ports and fleets. Ash fall and climate disturbances ripple across the region. The maritime network that sustained Minoan prosperity fractures. Another model is more cautious. Yes, tsunamis likely struck some coastal sites. Yes, regional climate may have been affected. But many Cretan palaces continue functioning after the eruption, at least for some decades. The main destructions of the so-called Neo-Palatial palaces around 1450 BCE might be separated in time from the volcanic catastrophe. In this view, Thera's eruption is a serious shock, but not necessarily the single cause of Minoan decline. Internal social tensions, shifting trade patterns, earthquakes, common in the Aegean, may have played roles. So might have new powers rising on the mainland, because while Crete is wrestling with disaster and reconstruction, another player is gaining strength to the north, the Mycenaean Greeks. Fortified centres like Mycenae, Pylos, Tiryns and Thebes are growing. Their elites bury themselves with rich grave goods. They use Linear B to keep palace accounts in Greek. Their pottery style spreads. Weapons and chariots become more prominent. Around the time Minoan palaces are destroyed or transformed, we see signs of mainland influence on Crete. Some sites show new types of burials characteristic of Mycenaean practice. Linear B tablets appear on Crete, especially at Knossos, indicating that at least one Cretan palace bureaucracy has switched to Greek administration. Art and material culture show more mainland motifs, more warrior iconography. Was there a violent Mycenaean conquest? A gradual takeover of trade? Local elites aligning with powerful mainland partners? The evidence allows for several scenarios. What is clear is that by the late Bronze Age, the balance has shifted. The palaces that matter most in the written records we can read are on the mainland, not on Crete. The Minoan moment of dominance has passed into something hybrid, then into memories. Later Greeks will tell stories. They will speak of King Minos, of a labyrinth beneath Knossos, of a bull-headed monster devouring Athenian youths, of Daedalus and Icarus escaping from Cretan captivity. They will imagine Crete as both tyrannical and sophisticated, a place of strange laws and powerful navy. Some of these tales may preserve faint echoes of real power struggles between Cretan mainland polities, or of rituals involving bulls, or of complex palace architecture that felt maze-like to visitors. But centuries of retelling, myth-making and political propaganda have reshaped whatever original events lay underneath. We cannot peel those myths back to a firm historical core. We can only set them alongside architecture, ceramics, and soil. From the archaeology, certain themes emerge with more confidence. Religion seems to have involved prominent female figures, goddess statues with bare breasts and raised arms, flanked by snakes or animals. Shrines occur in peak sanctuaries on mountain tops, in caves, in palace rooms with benches and altars. Symbols like the double axe and the horns of consecration repeat across sites. Whether this reflects a matriarchal system, a particular pantheon, or something else entirely is debated. But ritual clearly mattered, and it seems to have been woven into both household and palace life. The economy appears centralized at the palace level. Storage magazines with hundreds of pithoi, ceilings on doors and jars, Linear A tablets clustered near archives. All of this indicates that goods were collected, redistributed and recorded. Farmers brought in produce, artisans received raw materials, finished products moved out again, perhaps as rations or trade goods. We see not just subsistence, but surplus and specialization, metalworking, textile production, perfumed oils, fine ceramics. The palaces are command centres for an island-wide and probably overseas system. As for collapse, the picture is uneven. Some Cretan sites are violently destroyed around the mid-2nd millennium BCE, with burn layers and toppled walls. Others decline more gently, shifting from palace-centred life to smaller settlements. Over time, many Minoan religious symbols persist in altered forms, absorbed into a Mycenaean-dominated world. People do not vanish, languages can, scripts can. When Linear B appears on Crete, Linear A disappears from the record. The language encoded by Linear A may have survived for centuries as spoken speech among parts of the population, or it may have slowly yielded to Greek. Without texts, we can't trace that transition. What we can see is that a once dominant island civilization becomes, in later memory, a story told by others. The Minoan's own voice, caught in those flowing lines of Linear A, waits in silence. Numbers and ideograms hint at ships, harvests, offerings, but the sentences that tied them together, their explanations, their fears, their justifications for power, remain opaque. We walk their colonnades in our minds, hear the imagined murmur of markets, the crash of distant surf, and know that somewhere under the ash of Thera and the palace's fallen stones lies a version of events that no later poet, no mainland conqueror ever quite captured. By the time we reach the late 1200s BCE, that Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean world has become densely woven. Palaces on the Greek mainland are humming. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire stretches across central Turkey, writing in cuneiform about treaties and rebellions. In Syria and the Levant, ports like Ugarit send and receive letters in multiple languages, juggling trade, diplomacy, and debt. In Egypt, the New Kingdom pharaohs boast of campaigns into Canaan, of tribute and foreign princes. Copper moves from Cyprus, tin from Farther East, timber from Lebanon, grain from Egypt, textiles from everywhere. Ivory, glass, luxury pottery, gold, messengers carry tablets across hundreds of miles. A letter written in a royal court might be read weeks later in another, and replied to with gifts, brides, or threats. It feels, from the surviving documents, almost stable, almost inevitable. And then, in the span of a few decades around 1200 BCE, the pattern contracts. Archaeologists see it first in the ground. At site after site, there is a destruction layer near the end of the late Bronze Age. Burned palaces, collapsed storage rooms, arrowheads embedded in walls. At Mycenae and Tiryns, massive fortifications are damaged and hastily repaired. At Pylos, the palace burns so fiercely that its clay tablets harden in the flames and survive by accident, freezing an archive in its moment of death. Across the sea in Anatolia, the Hittite capital Hattusa is abandoned. In northern Syria, Ugarit's last letters are written as enemies approach. Excavations show charred archives, smashed temples, houses never rebuilt. Trade goods thin out. The fine wheel-made Mycenaean pottery that had flooded the eastern Mediterranean becomes scarcer outside its home region. Cypriot copper ingots, once common in shipwreck cargoes, are less visible in later layers. Luxury objects from far away become rare, then almost non-existent. Written records falter. Cuneiform tablets cease to be produced in many cities. The elaborate palace bureaucracies shrink or vanish. In Greece, Linear B disappears entirely, and with it, centuries of administrative writing in that region. Egypt continues to write, but its inscriptions speak of enemies, cost and strain. To later eyes, this looks like a wall at the end of the corridor of Bronze Age history. A sudden dimming. Why? Here we enter another zone of layered explanations, overlapping stressors rather than a single neat cause. One major line of evidence points to climate. Pollen cores from lakes and marshes in the eastern Mediterranean show shifts toward drier conditions around this time. Some regions record a sequence of poor years, reduced rainfall, failing harvests. In texts from places like Ugarit and Emar, there are references to famine, to people selling themselves for grain, to pleas for shipments of food. Drought alone doesn't explain armies and fires, but repeated bad years can undermine the tax base of a palace economy, fuel unrest, and make societies more vulnerable to any external shock. Warfare is another layer. The last tablets from Ugarit mention enemy ships offshore and threats from land armies. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III describe battles against foreign invaders by land and by sea. In central Anatolia, records speak of rebellious vassals and conflicts on multiple fronts. There is also economics and the fragility of complexity. Late Bronze Age elites built systems that depended on long-distance exchange. Palaces collected goods from their hinterlands, reworked them, and sent them out again as diplomatic gifts, trade, or military supplies. Specialists, scribes, charioteers, bronze smiths, full-time soldiers relied on that flow. When a few key links weaken because of drought, war, or political fractures, the whole structure can start to wobble. Historians sometimes call this a systems collapse, not one invader or one disaster, but many small and medium shocks hitting at once, overwhelming institutions that had little slack. And then there are the sea peoples. Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu show Ramesses III fighting enemies from the north, men with feathered headdresses, distinctive ships, ox carts carrying families. The accompanying texts list group names: Sheridan, Peliset, Jekka, and others. Egyptian scribes depict them as an alliance of foreign peoples, coming by sea and by land, laying waste to cities. For a long time, these sea peoples were treated as the prime movers of the collapse, mysterious raiders sweeping across the Mediterranean, burning everything in their path. But the more we look, the more that story blurs. Outside Egypt, there are no contemporary texts that clearly identify a single invading coalition doing the same thing everywhere. Many of the named groups may be migrants, refugees, or mercenaries as much as raiders. Some, like the Peliset, often linked to the Philistines, seem to settle and integrate into local societies afterward. The destruction layers themselves vary. Some cities show clear signs of violent attack, burned fortifications, mass casualties. Others seem to have been abandoned more gradually, with little evidence of battle. In some regions, rural settlements continue or even expand, while palatial centres vanish, suggesting shifts in political organisation rather than total depopulation. In Greece, the palaces fall, but people persist. Small villages dot the landscape. Pottery styles change. Long-distance trade shrinks, then slowly reopens in new forms. For a few centuries, written records from this region are almost entirely absent. Later Greeks will remember this as a kind of heroic age, full of warriors and wanderers. But the actual administrative voices of the Mycenaean world are gone. In the Levant, new polities emerge. City-states are reconfigured. Groups remembered later as Aramaeans, Israelites, Philistines, and others appear more prominently in the archaeological and textual record. Iron tools and weapons begin to replace bronze, slowly at first, then more rapidly. Alphabetic writing, simpler than cuneiform and easier to learn, spreads among these new and reshaped communities. Even in places that survive, like Egypt, there is a sense of contraction. The empire pulls back its borders, monument building slows, inscriptions focus on defense and restoration rather than expansion. The confident, wide-ranging world of the earlier New Kingdom narrows. In this way, the Late Bronze Age collapse is less like a single building suddenly demolished, and more like a network losing node after node until the pattern itself changes. Some lights go out with a crash, others flicker and dim. Some shift into new circuits entirely. Out of that fractured landscape, new political forms and new modes of writing take shape. Small kingdoms instead of great empires, iron-using farmers instead of chariot aristocracies, short alphabetic inscriptions instead of long cuneiform archives. And for historians, that transformation creates a silence that is strangely uneven. Palaces, with their scribes and their clay tablets, disappear. Everyday people who never wrote much to begin with go on living. Their stories continue, but for a while, fewer of them leave a written trace. It is into that thinned-out historical record that later Greeks will half remember as myth that we move next. Later Greek writers would look back at this period and call it a dark age. To them it was the dim, half-remembered time between the shining palaces of the Mycenaean heroes and the clear, documented world of their own city-states. A stretch where the great deeds of ancestors took place, but written memory did not. When 19th and early 20th century scholars borrowed that phrase, Dark Age meant something a bit different. It meant darkness in the evidence. Fewer texts, fewer monuments, fewer obvious signs of centralized power, a gap between the linear B tablets of the palaces and the later Greek alphabetic inscriptions carved on stone. Today, many historians are uneasy with the term. It suggests total collapse, universal misery, a civilizational black hole. But the more we excavate, the less that picture holds. The darkness is mostly ours, a lack of written sources, not necessarily a complete lack of life, creativity or continuity. What does change is the kind of world the evidence points to. Before the collapse, Mycenaean Greece is organized around palace centers like Pylos, Mycenae, Tiryns, Thebes. Linear B tablets there record barley rations, bronze allotments, textile quotas. It is a bureaucratic landscape, where writing is a tool of administration, controlled by elite scribes. When the palaces burn, that system disappears. Linear B is not just a script, it is an entire way of managing economy and power. Its disappearance tells us that the centralized institutions that needed that accounting also vanished or shrank to the point where such record-keeping was no longer necessary. For several centuries after, there is no sign of any writing at all in the Greek world. This is one of the strangest silences in Mediterranean history. To the east in the Levant, alphabetic scripts blossom. Short inscriptions appear on pots, seals, walls. Phoenician traders experiment with ways to capture language using just a couple dozen signs. Greece, by contrast, seems to go mute. The archaeology, though, is not silent. Instead of palatial complexes, we find smaller, more scattered settlements. Hilltop villages, modest clusters of houses, sometimes only a few families. The overall population may have declined, but it doesn't vanish. People regroup at a different scale. Burial customs shift. In the Mycenaean period, elite shaft graves and tholos beehive tombs dominate. After the collapse, we see more modest graves, simpler offerings. Then, in the early Iron Age, cremation becomes more common in some regions, with urns buried in cemeteries that can be traced over generations. The way the dead are treated suggests changing ideas of status, community, and the afterlife. Pottery styles change too, and they help us track time through this dark stretch. The elaborate pictorial scenes of late Mycenaean ceramics give way to simpler forms. Then, slowly, geometric patterns, meanders, triangles, circles take over. This so-called geometric pottery is precise, almost obsessive in its repetition. As we move into the 8th century BCE, those patterns begin to frame human figures, chariots, ships, The pots become, in a way, the first texts of the New Age, repeating motifs that carry meaning through time and space. Why did this new world look so different? One explanation is population movement. Some groups may have left the mainland for the islands or the coast of Anatolia, contributing to what later Greeks remembered as the Aeolian, Ionian, and Dorian migrations. Others may have moved inland, away from vulnerable coastal palaces into defensible uplands. These shifts could fragment old political structures and create new regional identities. Another angle is decentralization. Without palaces coordinating production and redistributing goods, economic life would have fallen back on smaller units, households, local chiefs, village councils. Authority becomes more local, more personal, long-distance trade contracts, but it doesn't end. Instead of palace-run convoys, we probably see smaller, more opportunistic exchanges. Archaeological finds from this period show new trade patterns. Imported objects are rarer but not absent. There are hints of connections with Cyprus, the Levant, and eventually with emerging Phoenician networks. Metalworking continues now with iron slowly replacing bronze. Skills survive, but their institutional home has changed. In the absence of writing, how did people remember anything beyond a human lifetime? Here we step into the realm of oral tradition. Stories can be told, retold, shaped and reshaped across generations. Genealogies recite the names of ancestors. Tales about wars, wanderings, feuds, and heroic deeds circulate at feasts. Poets and singers become living archives, their performances the medium through which the past is kept alive. The Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, almost certainly grew out of this oral world. They are written down only centuries later, in a Greece that has rediscovered writing. But the language of the poems contains layers, old formulaic phrases, archaic words, glimpses of social practices that feel closer to the early Iron Age than to the later classical city-states. Many scholars think these epics preserve echoes of the post-Mycenaean centuries, a world of small warrior elites, guest friendship across regions, loosely organized communities rather than rigid palace bureaucracies. At the same time, they also project back the concerns of the time when they were finally fixed. Ideas about honor, competition, and politics that belong to emerging city-states. They are, in other words, not a reliable chronicle of events, but a kind of cultural memory. A palimpsest of centuries of storytelling, where real experiences, older memories, and poetic invention overlap. Somewhere in that long oral phase, another transformation begins. Greek speakers encounter the alphabetic scripts of their eastern neighbours. Perhaps through Phoenician traders, perhaps through mixed communities on the islands. At some point in the 9th or 8th century BCE, someone adapts that consonant-based system to fit Greek, adding signs for vowels. This new script is radically easier to learn than Linear B had been. It is not locked inside palaces. It can be picked up by merchants, craftsmen, poets. Graffiti on pottery shards, short dedications, and later lines of verse begin to appear. Writing returns to Greece, but it is a different kind of writing than before. Instead of serving only administrators, it can serve memory, law, religion, and art. It captures the Homeric poems. It records treaties and decrees. It lets city-states define themselves in words carved in stone. Between the last Linear B tablet and the first Greek alphabetic inscription, there is a gap of several centuries. In that space, the palaces fall, the old bureaucracy dies, communities shrink and reconfigure. Stories pass from mouth to ear in the glow of hearth fires. When the light of writing returns, the world it illuminates is new. Not a palace system, but a patchwork of polis, each with its own institutions, myths, and ambitions. The Dark Age is the bridge between those worlds. Its darkness is less a void and more a place where our usual tools, archives, chronicles, monumental inscriptions fail us. To move through it, we have to read potsherds, graves, settlement patterns, and poems that remember and forget at the same time. Beyond it lies the more familiar Greece of temples, philosophers, and historians, who will, in turn, leave their own gaps, their own silences, for us to wonder about. If Greece's Dark Age is a silence created by the absence of writing, Carthage's darkness is stranger. Here we know the city was literate. We know it managed a complex economy, ruled a maritime empire, sent ships beyond the familiar edges of the Mediterranean. And yet, almost none of its own voice survives. Carthage was a Phoenician colony founded, according to later tradition, by migrants from Tyre in the late 9th or early 8th century BCE. Over the centuries it grew from a coastal outpost into the dominant power of the central and western Mediterranean. Its ships ranged from North Africa to Spain, from Sardinia to Sicily. Carthaginian merchants dealt in metals from Iberia, grain from Africa, timber and luxury goods from across the sea. They established colonies and trading posts on strategic coasts and islands, knitting together a loose but far-reaching network. To manage all this, they kept records. We can be fairly sure of that, because every other large, complex state of the time did. Contracts, port logs, tax lists, treaties, religious regulations, these things do not run on memory alone. Ancient authors mention Carthaginian treaties, agricultural manuals, even histories. But Carthage met a conqueror who wrote the story: Rome. By the time Rome and Carthage collided, in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE, both were expanding republics with imperial ambitions. Their rivalry produced 3 wars, vast casualty lists, and some of the most famous campaigns in ancient history. Hannibal crossing the Alps with his war elephants, Roman fleets learning disastrously and then successfully how to fight at sea. Almost everything we know about these events comes from Greek and Roman writers. Polybius, Livy, Appian, later compilers and commentators, all writing from the victor's side or under the victor's political and cultural shadow. Some admired Carthaginian skill. Many portrayed them as greedy merchants, cruel sacrificers of children, a people defined by wealth, cunning, and moral corruption. These authors had incentives. They were explaining Rome's rise. Rome did not just defeat a rival, it defeated a villain. Turning Carthage into the menacing other helped justify expansion, losses, and eventual annihilation. A story in which Rome saves the Mediterranean from a sinister, untrustworthy power is easier to tell than a story of 2 complex societies locked in a tragic competition. Archaeology lets us test and sometimes soften these narratives. Excavations in Carthage itself and at Punic sites across the western Mediterranean tell us that Carthaginian life was not simply a mirror of Roman stereotypes. Houses, workshops, sanctuaries, port installations, cemeteries, they show a population engaged in ordinary activities: farming, pottery making, metalworking, trade, worship, family life. From material remains, we can sketch parts of their world. Religion first. Carthage inherited gods from Phoenicia, Baal Hammon, Tanit, and others, then developed its own local versions. Temples and sanctuaries with altars, votive stelae carved with symbols of deities, inscriptions in Punic dedicate offerings to our Lord or to the face of Tanit. These spaces suggest organized cults, priestly roles and rituals timed to the agricultural and political life of the city. Trade appears in the distribution of Punic amphorae and goods. Characteristic Carthaginian jars show up in Spain, Sardinia, Sicily, even on small islands and remote harbours. Their shapes and stamps shift over time, letting archaeologists trace changing trade routes and state control. Coinage, with Punic legends and iconography, points to a sophisticated monetary economy and a government that minted and regulated currency. Politics is more elusive, but not invisible. Later authors describe Carthage as a republic, with magistrates, councils, and powerful families. Inscriptions and burials hint at an elite who advertised their status through tomb architecture, imported luxuries, and monumental dedications. The city seems to have balanced oligarchic families, elected officers and military commanders commanding citizen and mercenary forces. Then there is the most disturbing accusation: child sacrifice. Greek and Roman writers insist Carthage sacrificed infants to the gods in times of crisis. For a long time, many modern scholars dismissed this as hostile propaganda. But archaeological digs uncovered areas known as tephets, open-air sanctuaries containing urns with cremated remains of very young children and animals, marked by stelae dedicated to deities like Baal-Hamon and Tanit. What exactly these sites represent is still debated. One interpretation, closer to the ancient accusations, is that they were indeed reserved for sacrificial victims, perhaps from specific families or under specific vows. Another view suggests they were specialized cemeteries for infants who died naturally, given a particular religious treatment. Analyses of the bones, while improving, are complicated by cremation and poor preservation. Some studies point to elevated infant mortality rather than selective killing. Others argue the demographic patterns are hard to reconcile with ordinary deaths alone. Here, more than almost anywhere else, the gap in Carthage's own texts matters. A few Punic inscriptions speak of vows and offerings, but they are brief, formulaic. There is no surviving Carthaginian theological treatise, no internal debate, no law code we can consult. We are left triangulating between hostile literary testimony and mute, fragmentary bones. The end of Carthage deepened this silence. After the Third Punic War in 146 BCE, Rome captured and destroyed the city. Later, Roman writers speak of it being burned, levelled, cursed. Some of that may be rhetorical exaggeration, but the practical effects were real. Buildings collapsed, archives, if they still existed in central repositories, would have burned or rotted. Papyri and wooden tablets do not survive catastrophic sieges and centuries of rebuilding. Rome reused the site. A new Roman Carthage rose over the ruins, with its own streets, forums, baths. Stones from Punic buildings were repurposed into Roman ones. Walls were cut, flipped, recarved. Every renovation scrambled layers of evidence, erased inscriptions, sent broken tablets into lime kilns. A few Carthaginian texts did escape, but only by being absorbed into someone else's culture. An agricultural manual by a Carthaginian named Mago was so highly regarded that, according to later reports, Rome ordered it translated into Latin before the city's destruction. The original Punic version is lost. Only fragments and references survive in Greek and Latin writers quoting it. Carthage's knowledge lived on, but under foreign names and alphabets. So when we talk about Carthage, we are listening to a choir where the main singer has been silenced. We reconstruct a maritime empire from enemy accounts, from buried ports and warehouses, from scattered inscriptions that survived by luck. We see their gods in worn carvings, their trade in broken amphorae, their politics in the shadows left by Roman fears and admiration. And we are reminded that history is often written literally by rivals, and that conquest does not just topple walls. It can also decide whose memories are copied, whose libraries are spared, and whose stories become a gap we can only half fill. If Carthage shows us what happens when one city's archives are physically erased, Alexandria shows us something subtler, and in some ways more unsettling, how fragile the very idea of a world's memory can be. When people say the Library of Alexandria, they often picture a single building, one enormous hall filled with scrolls, burned to the ground in a single night. A clean tragedy. One moment knowledge exists, the next it's gone. History is messier. In reality, the library was probably a cluster of institutions that changed over centuries. The core was the Mausoleum, the Temple of the Muses, founded under the early Ptolemies after Alexander the Great's conquest. It was part research institute, part royal propaganda project, a community of scholars supported by the king producing texts, commentaries and prestige. Attached to it, or closely linked, was a major book collection. Ptolemaic rulers reportedly ordered ships entering Alexandria's harbour to surrender any scrolls they carried. Scribes would copy them. Sometimes the copies went back to the owners, while the best originals were kept. Other texts were bought, borrowed, or simply seized from across the eastern Mediterranean. There may also have been a separate, later collection in the Serapeum, another temple complex in the city, which functioned at times as an auxiliary library. Over 3 centuries of Ptolemaic and then Roman rule, these institutions grew, shrank, reorganized, and shifted location. So when we ask, how did the Library of Alexandria burn, we hit a problem. We are not talking about a single room, or even a single lifetime. We are talking about layers of buildings and collections, vulnerable to different kinds of damage at different moments. Ancient sources hint at several blows. Julius Caesar, trapped in Alexandria in 48-47 BCE, set fire to Egyptian ships in the harbour. The flames spread to parts of the city. Later writers disagree about what exactly burned. Some mention warehouses and nearby structures that may have held scrolls. It is possible that thousands of books were lost then. It is also possible that the main royal collection survived, wounded but not destroyed. Centuries later, in the 3rd century CE, the Roman Emperor Aurelian fought to retake Alexandria during a period of civil war. Parts of the city were devastated. The Brucheion district, where the original Mausoleum seems to have stood, suffered heavily. If a library was still active there, it may have been damaged or displaced again. The Serapeum, with its own collection, lasted longer. It became a focal point of religious tensions in the late Roman Empire, as Christianity gained power and old cults were suppressed. In 391 CE, under the Emperor Theodosius I, the Serapeum was attacked, and its pagan temple complex destroyed. Some sources imply that books stored there were also lost, though details are hazy. By the time Arab armies took Alexandria in the 7th century CE, whatever remained of the original royal library had already been transformed, scattered, or absorbed into other collections. Later medieval stories about conquerors ordering baths heated with pagan scrolls are almost certainly legends, written centuries after the fact. Instead of one great fire, we have something slower. Wars, urban fighting, religious conflict, budget cuts, neglect. Staff not replaced, scribes not paid, rooms repurposed. Collections dispersed, scrolls eaten by insects, rotted by damp, or simply not recopied when they wore out. And this is where Alexandria's story merges with something even bigger, the ordinary ways that knowledge disappears. In the ancient world, every book had to be copied by hand. Papyrus scrolls did not last forever. Parchment codices lasted longer, but not indefinitely. A text survived only if someone, somewhere, cared enough to have it copied again and again. This created bottlenecks. A work might go from being widely read to being the specialty of a few scholars. If those scholars died, or their city fell, or their language fell out of use, the chain of copying could break. A single missing generation of scribes could be enough. Language shifts were another filter. When Greek declined in the Western Roman Empire, Latin works became easier to transmit there. Greek texts fared better in the Eastern Byzantine world, but not everything made it across. Many scientific and philosophical works survived only because they were translated into Syriac or Arabic in the early Islamic centuries, copied in Baghdad and other centers of learning, and later retranslated back into Latin. What did not attract the attention of translators, what seemed less useful, less prestigious, or harder to understand, was more likely to vanish. Then there is simple neglect, not active destruction. Just choices. A monastery has limited parchment and time. Scribes must decide, copy this sermon or that play, this gospel commentary or that technical treatise on siege engines, this widely used grammar or that obscure poem. Over centuries, these routine decisions shape the survival map of ancient literature. We can see the ghost outlines of what was lost in the references that remain. We know of entire genres mostly through titles. Of the more than 100 plays, Aeschylus wrote, only a handful complete survive. Sophocles may have written over 120. We have 7 intact. Euripides wrote around 90. Again, a few survive in full. The rest exist, if at all, as fragments quoted by later authors or preserved on torn papyrus scraps from Egyptian rubbish heaps. Aristotle composed dialogues, as well as the more technical treatises we now read. Ancient testimonies describe these dialogues as literary and popular, possibly the works that made his reputation in his own time. They are almost entirely gone. We know them mainly from later summaries and stray quotations. Historians, too, speak of lost predecessors. Polybius mentions earlier Greek historians whose works do not survive. Livy refers to Roman annalists we can no longer read. Early chronicles of the Persian Empire, Carthaginian records beyond Mago's treatise, local histories of dozens of cities. They flicker in secondary citations, then vanish. In science and mathematics, the pattern repeats. We have some of Archimedes, but not all. We suspect Hellenistic astronomers and engineers developed models, devices and theories now known only in stripped-down form through later summaries. Even within surviving texts, we sometimes see references to the usual method or, as shown in the lost work, and the trail stops there. This uneven survival shapes the stories we tell. Because more philosophical works survived from Plato than from rival schools, Plato can look more central to the development of Western thought than he necessarily was in his own time. Because Christian scribes favoured certain pagan authors, Cicero for rhetoric, Virgil for language, bits of Seneca and Horace, our picture of Roman literature is skewed toward what late antique Christians found acceptable or useful. Narratives of Greek rational science, Roman legal genius, or linear progress through specific thinkers are built on the subset of texts that happen to pass through these narrow copying funnels. Other voices, skeptical, mystical, technical, local, are underrepresented or missing. When we imagine the Library of Alexandria at its height, we are not just thinking of scrolls stored in shelves. We are thinking of all the alternative paths human thought might have taken if different things had been preserved. Maybe there were medical treatises describing experimental techniques that were later rediscovered independently. Maybe there were histories written from the perspective of peoples whose own archives were later destroyed. Maybe there were philosophical schools that combined ideas in ways that would feel strange to us now, but not unimaginable. We cannot know their contents. What we can say, cautiously, is this. The pattern of loss we can see suggests that the ancient world was more diverse, more experimental, and more interconnected than the surviving canon alone implies. The silence around Alexandria is not just about a building that burned. It is about how easily the record of a civilization can narrow, how much of what people once knew can pass into darkness, without any single dramatic catastrophe, and how the stories we tell about our past are built on the thin threads that happen to survive the long night of copying, conquest, and chance. If Alexandria shows us how knowledge can thin out over centuries, Rome shows us something stranger, how a civilization that wrote so much can still leave us staring at blank spots, trying to guess what happened in the gaps. We tend to think of Roman history as solid, almost over-documented. Names of emperors lined up in order, dates, battles, laws, letters. The kind of past you can put into a neat timeline. But that clarity is uneven. Some stretches of Roman time are lit up almost day by day. The late Republic, for example, survives in obsessive detail. Cicero's speeches and private letters, Caesar's commentaries, Sallust and Livy, and dozens of minor authors. We can follow political feuds, court cases, even jokes told at dinner. Then there are decades where the spotlight narrows to a few distant beams. A handful of chroniclers writing generations later. A couple of inscriptions, a confusing burst of coins with unfamiliar faces, and in between, shadows. Part of the reason is simple survival bias. Elite, literate Romans tended to write most when they felt their world was interesting, or collapsing, or both. Periods that seemed stable, or too chaotic to process, attracted fewer contemporary narratives. Later copyists, centuries down the line, favoured some authors and ignored others. Wars, plagues, and the slow erosion of libraries did the rest. All of this comes into sharp focus in one particularly tangled stretch, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century. Between roughly 235 and 284 CE, the Roman Empire did not formally fall, but it came uncomfortably close. Emperors rose and died in rapid succession. Armies mutinied. Provinces broke away and proclaimed their own rulers. Plagues swept through cities. Frontiers buckled under pressure from new confederations of Goths, Persians, and others. You might expect such drama to be described in vivid contemporary detail. Instead, we get something more like a stuttering radio signal. The main narrative sources for this period are later partial and often partisan. A writer in the late 4th century trying to make sense of events 100 or 150 years earlier. Another author with a clear agenda, praising some emperors as models of virtue and condemning others as degenerates, sometimes on very thin evidence. A notorious collection called the Historia Augusta, mixing genuine documents with invented speeches, and probably outright fabrications. Modern historians read it with tweezers and gloves. When you lay these texts side by side, the story doesn't quite line up. Names and dates slip. Battles are described without clear locations. Usurpers, short-lived rivals to the emperor, flicker into existence in a single line and vanish again. Some may have been real, others may be duplications of the same figure under different names, or rhetorical inventions meant to make a reign look more chaotic than it was. Into these narrative gaps, other forms of evidence step forward. Coins, for instance. Roman mints were prolific, and coins survive in enormous numbers. During the 3rd century, their designs tell a compressed, desperate story. New emperors appear suddenly on the obverse, sometimes with titles that sound more like wishes than realities. Restorer of the world, bringer of peace, conqueror of the Germans, the Goths, the Persians. When several faces overlap in time and in different regions, it can signal competing authorities. Inscriptions carved in stone add another layer. Dedications to emperors, record of building projects, honorific statues set up by city councils. Sometimes an emperor barely mentioned in the surviving histories shows up repeatedly in inscriptions, suggesting a stronger or longer rule than later writers remembered or were willing to admit. Papyri from Egypt offer yet another angle. These are not grand narratives, but everyday documents, tax receipts, army discharge papers, petitions to officials. They show which emperor's name was used in official dating formulas, which policies were actually enforced, how local economies reacted to inflation and coinage changes. You can watch prices rise, tax burdens shift, and people try to navigate new regulations that our narrative sources barely mention. Even with all this, the picture remains fuzzy. Later Roman historians, looking back on the 3rd century from the relative stability of the 4th, tended to compress events. They smoothed tangled successions into simple lists. They grouped multiple invasions into single barbarian storms. They presented economic change as sharp breaks, rather than gradual drifts. This created an illusion of clarity, a neat sequence of emperors replacing what was likely a mess of overlapping claims. A dramatic crisis standing in for a long, uneven process of military, fiscal, and administrative strain. Underneath that simplification lie real uncertainties. We do not always know exactly who controlled which border at which moment. In some years, the written sources claim the frontiers were collapsing everywhere, while archaeology shows continued building, trade, and even local prosperity in certain regions. In other cases, texts are calm, but sudden destructions in the archaeological record hint at raids or wars, never recorded in surviving chronicles. Some usurpers exist only in the form of rare coins struck in one city for a short time, or in a single mutilated inscription. Were they serious contenders, or brief local experiments in rebellion, quickly crushed and later exaggerated? Our sources disagree, and the material record is too thin to settle the question. Economic change is equally hard to pin down. Ancient writers complain about debased coinage and price increases, telling stories of soldiers refusing pay in bad silver. Archaeology finds hordes of increasingly low-quality coins, shifts in burial goods, changes in diet. But tying these strands together into a single narrative of decline or collapse risks, oversimplifying what may have been a patchwork, hardship in some areas, adaptation in others, resilience in many. Sometimes the ground quite literally argues back against the texts. A written source might describe a town as destroyed and abandoned, yet excavations show continued occupation with modified defences and new building styles. Or an author may praise an emperor for great construction projects that leave no trace outside of rhetoric. Conversely, massive fortifications along a frontier can appear, with no surviving written explanation, suggesting strategic anxieties that never made it into our literary record, or whose accounts were simply lost. The result is a Rome that looks less like a straight, well-lit road, and more like a map with missing pieces. Bright clusters of detailed narrative, separated by stretches where we navigate by scattered stones, faded inscriptions, and the faces on worn coins. In those missing years, we are reminded that even for one of the best documented empires in antiquity, our picture of the past is still a reconstruction built from fragments, and that the confidence of a neat imperial timeline can hide a much stranger, more uncertain story underneath. If Rome's problem is too many words arranged in confusing ways, Teotihuacan has almost the opposite issue. Here we have one of the largest cities in the ancient world, a place that, at its height around the first half of the first millennium CE, may have held 100, maybe 200,000 people. A planned city laid out on a rigid grid, with a central avenue running straight for kilometres. Monumental pyramids rising above apartment compounds. Workshops specialised in obsidian blades, fine pottery, painted murals. An urban machine powerful enough that its influence shows up hundreds of kilometres away, in the art, architecture and politics of other Mesoamerican cultures. And yet, we don't really know who ruled it. Teotihuacan sits in the highland basin of central Mexico, not far from where Mexico City sprawls today. When it was flourishing, Rome was still standing across the ocean. The city's core was organized around what we call the Avenue of the Dead, flanked by temples, platforms, and multi-story apartment complexes built in carefully planned compounds. At the northern end stands the Pyramid of the Moon, aligned with distant mountains. Nearby, the vast Pyramid of the Sun dominates the landscape, built in stages on top of a natural cave that may have been seen as a portal to the underworld. Further south, a complex of stepped platforms and serpent-covered facades forms what we call the Temple of the Feathered Serpent. This was not a haphazard settlement. It was a consciously designed urban project, with drainage systems, standardized housing units, dedicated neighborhoods for foreign merchants and craft workers. Teotihuacan exported obsidian tools, ceramics, styles, and possibly political authority across much of Mesoamerica. Maya cities hundreds of kilometers away record visits from lords linked to Teotihuacan and adopt its imagery. But when we look for the city's own written voice, things get quiet. Later, Maya sites are covered in inscriptions, long texts carved in stone, dated with precise calendar notations, listing rulers, wars, alliances. From the Maya lowlands, we can build king lists, track dynasties, reconstruct battles. Teotihuacan is different. There are symbols, glyph-like signs, calendrical notations, short labels on murals, on pottery, on stone, but there is nothing like the long historical inscriptions the Maya carved. Whatever script Teotihuacan used has not been convincingly deciphered, and it may never have been used for narrative history in the same way. So we are left reading the city itself as the main text. Murals, architecture, and burials become our sources for ideology and power. Residential compounds are decorated with repeated themes: feathered serpents, jaguars, owls, elaborate headdresses, processions of figures that might be priests, warriors, or gods. Scenes show water, maize, and blooming plants, flowing from central figures, suggesting a concern with fertility and cosmic order. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent is particularly striking. Its facade once carried rows of carved serpent heads and goggle-eyed deities associated with rain or warfare. In front of it, excavators found mass burials, dozens, maybe more than 100 individuals, many with their hands bound, interred with weapons and symbolic objects. These appear to be sacrificial victims, possibly warriors or captives, killed as part of the temple's dedication. High-status burials within compounds contain fine greenstone objects, shell ornaments, elaborate costumes. Some individuals seem to have been associated with specific gods or roles, their graves echoing particular iconography on the walls. Other compounds show evidence of foreign origins: Maya-style pottery, Gulf Coast shells, Oaxaca-style artifacts, hinting at resident communities from distant regions. From these fragments, archaeologists try to infer how power worked. One possibility is that Teotihuacan was ruled by kings much like the later Maya Ajuwab, but that they chose not to display themselves as prominently in art and text. Some murals show large, richly dressed figures who could be rulers, surrounded by attendants and symbols of authority. The alignment of pyramids and plazas, the ability to mobilize labor for massive projects, all suggest centralized leadership. Another model argues for something more collective. Compared to Maya cities, Teotihuacan lacks obvious portraits of named individuals, and its iconography leans heavily on deities and abstract symbols rather than personal histories. Some scholars have suggested a council of lineages, or corporate groups sharing power, a kind of oligarchic theocracy in which no single person's name dominated the landscape. Yet the evidence is ambiguous. The city may have shifted forms of governance over its centuries of existence. Early phases could have been more king-centered, later ones more collective, or the reverse. Without readable narrative texts, We are reconstructing political systems from floor plans, burial clusters, and what is shown or not shown on painted walls. The end of Teotihuacan is just as murky. Sometime in the 6th century CE, the city begins to falter. Archaeology shows widespread burning in the ceremonial core, elite compounds, temples and administrative buildings blackened by fire. But the destruction seems selective. Commoner residential areas continue for a time. This has led many researchers to suggest internal unrest, perhaps an uprising against the ruling elites, rather than foreign invasion. At the same time, climate records from lake sediments and tree rings point to possible droughts affecting central Mexico. Crop failures could have strained the delicate balance of a dense urban population. Trade networks may have shifted. Regional centres once influenced by Teotihuacan might have pulled away, creating political fragmentation that undercut the city's dominance. There is no single agreed cause. A combination of internal tensions, environmental stress, and changing regional dynamics is likely. What we see in the archaeological record is a gradual thinning out. Fewer luxury goods, less monumental construction, more evidence of abandonment. The supercity empties, leaving its pyramids standing over fields and smaller settlements. Centuries later, when other peoples moved through the basin of Mexico, they did not see ruins of a random town. They saw a place already ancient, already mysterious. The Aztecs, arriving long after Teotihuacan's fall, gave it the name we use today. Teotihuacan, often translated as the place where gods were made, or the place where one becomes a god. In their own sacred stories, this was the site where the gods gathered to create the current sun, to set the cosmos in motion. They walked its abandoned avenues as pilgrims, performed rituals among its pyramids, and incorporated its memory into their origin myths. For them, the city's silence was not a problem to be solved, but a sign of its power. A stage left behind by unknown actors, ready to be repopulated with divine drama. For us, Teotihuacan is another reminder that scale does not guarantee clarity. A city can reshape a region, send its influence far beyond its walls, and still leave almost no direct account of how its rulers thought, argued, or justified their power. We trace their decisions in the angle of a pyramid, the pattern of a mural, the positions of skeletons beneath a temple floor. We listen for voices in stone and paint, and accept that some of the loudest places in the ancient world now speak only in whispers. If Teotihuacan is a grand stage without a script, the classic Maya world is almost the opposite problem. Here we have scripts. We can read names, dates, events, even boasts. We can line up dynasties on timelines, match eclipses to carved records, follow wars from city to city like a grim relay race. And yet, when we reach the moment people like to call the Maya collapse, the story blurs anyway. First, that word, collapse. It conjures images of sudden catastrophe, cities burning in a single season, entire peoples vanishing overnight. For the classic Maya, that isn't what the evidence shows. What happens between roughly 750 and 900 CE in much of the southern lowlands is something slower, stranger, and more uneven. City after city stops building big monuments. Carved stelae with long count dates, those precise calendar inscriptions the Maya used to fix events in cosmic time, start thinning out, then go silent. Royal palaces are abandoned or repurposed. Populations in some core areas drop sharply. Political capitals fragment into smaller centres or disappear from the record entirely. But people don't vanish. Languages don't vanish. Even the culture we call Maya doesn't vanish. It moves, it reshapes, it survives in different places under different political arrangements. So when historians talk about the classic Maya collapse, What they are really describing is a breakdown of a particular political and demographic order. The network of competing divine kings and their courtly cities, the dense populations clustered around them, the monumental building programs that made their power visible in stone. It is a collapse of a system, not of a people. One of the reasons we can see this system so clearly is epigraphy, the study of inscriptions. Unlike Teotihuacan, many classic Maya sites are covered in writing. Stairways and lintels and stelae carry long narrative texts. They tell us the names of kings and queens. They record births, accessions, marriages, captives taken in war, monuments dedicated on auspicious days. They anchor events to the Maya long count calendar, which we can correlate with our own. For the classic period, this gives us a surprisingly fine-grained chronology. We can say that a ruler at Copan dedicated a monument on a specific day in the 8th century, and that a rival at Quirigua captured him not long after. We can see patterns of alliance and conflict stretching across centuries. But inscriptions have their own kind of bias. They are overwhelmingly elite documents, carved by and for those who controlled labour and resources. They are propaganda as much as history, designed to celebrate victories, legitimize claims to the throne, tie rulers to gods and ancestors. They rarely tell us when crops failed, except indirectly. They don't record the quiet erosion of soil or the slow lowering of water tables. They don't say the people in the outlying villages are leaving, or our trading partners are having their own problems. They almost never admit defeat. As the classic period draws to a close in many regions, the carved record doesn't give us a neat narrative of decline. It just thins out, dates become sparser, royal lines become harder to follow. Then the monuments stop altogether. We are left to fill in the gaps with other kinds of evidence. Climate records from lake cores and cave stalagmites suggest that the southern lowlands went through episodes of serious drought in the late 8th and 9th centuries. Not a single bad year, but a pattern of reduced rainfall, punctuated by especially intense dry spells. For cities that relied on rain-fed reservoirs and thin tropical soils, this would have been dangerous. A few missed harvests in a densely populated region can ripple outward. Malnutrition, disease, social unrest, migration. At the same time, the inscriptions we do have from the later classic show increasing warfare. Lords capturing other lords, cities starving or being burned, alliances forming and fracturing faster, as kings tried to hold on to prestige and tribute in a tightening landscape of resources. Archaeology adds more pieces. In some centres we see evidence of deforestation, erosion and intensified agriculture, signs that land was being pushed hard to support growing populations. In others, we find hastily built defences, burned buildings or mass burials that might hint at violence. In yet others, the record is quieter but shows gradual depopulation, fewer luxury imports, smaller building projects. No single factor stands alone. Drought on its own doesn't cause a political system to implode. Warfare on its own doesn't depopulate whole regions. But put them together, climate variability, resource stress, elite competition, the burden of monumental building and constant war on a taxed population, and you begin to see how a complex, interlocking network could unravel. And it doesn't unravel everywhere in the same way. Regional variation is one of the most important and most easily overlooked parts of this story. While many southern lowland cities, places like Tikal, Copan, Palenque, decline or lose their royal courts, other Maya regions continue on. Some northern centres on the Yucatan Peninsula not only persist but flourish after the so-called collapse. Chichen Itza grows into a major power. Coastal trading towns expand, linking inland communities to maritime routes. Even within the collapsed zones, there are pockets of continuity. Smaller communities live among the ruins, reusing buildings, farming nearby fields. Not all monumental construction stops at once. Some local rulers keep carving dates long after their more famous neighbours have gone quiet. This uneven geography makes easy stories difficult. There is no single day when the Maya calendar ends. The much publicised long count turning point in 2012 CE was just that, a turning of a cycle in a system of timekeeping that long outlived many classic kings. In reality, different centres stop using long count dates at different times, for different reasons if they stop at all. The inscriptions we do have for the late period still centre on elite actors. Even their silence is a kind of elite silence. Ordinary farmers, craft workers, traders, people whose decisions to stay or leave, to cooperate or resist, would have shaped the fate of cities, remain largely invisible. What we can glimpse, though, is resilience. After the classic political order fractures, Maya communities do not simply disappear into myth. They adapt. Populations shift north and east. Political structures change from divine kings with towering pyramids to different forms of leadership embedded in new networks of trade and tribute. Ritual life evolves, but many symbols, deities, and calendar practices continue. When the Spanish arrive more than half a millennium later, they find Maya polity still very much alive. They find people keeping complex calendars, performing rituals, maintaining historical memories in oral and painted forms. They find languages descended from those spoken in the classic courts, still used around cooking fires and in marketplace arguments. The collapse sits in between these worlds, a period where our most verbose sources go quiet, where royal monuments fail us, just when we most want them to explain what went wrong. We see drought patterns in stalagmites, warfare in toppled stelae, resource stress in pollen grains. We can model scenarios, propose chains of cause and effect. But the lived experience, the sounds of debate in council houses, the whispered plans to migrate, the stories parents told children as they left an ancestral city for a new home, those remain beyond our reach. Once again, history tilts toward those who had the power to carve in stone, and even their voices falter when systems strain. What remains in the forested ruins is not a vanished people, but the trace of one particular way of being Maya that could not sustain itself forever. Other ways would take its place, just as, on distant islands far from Mesoamerica, other societies would confront their own turning points, balancing between endurance and decline. Across an ocean so wide, it might as well be another planet. There is a small triangle of land where this question of endurance and decline has been argued more fiercely than almost anywhere else. Rapa Nui, Easter Island. It sits alone in the South Pacific, thousands of kilometres from the nearest continent, a volcanic speck ringed by cliffs and swells. And on that tiny island stand the Moai, massive stone figures, some towering over 10 metres tall carved bodies with oversized heads, heavy brows and gazes that seem to look inward, toward the land, not out to sea. For a long time, Rapa Nui became the textbook example of what happens when humans push an ecosystem too far. You might have heard the story. Once upon a time, the tale goes, the island was covered in palm forest. The first Polynesian settlers arrived, thrived, and began carving moai to honour ancestors. To move those giants, they cut trees for rollers, ropes, sleds. They cleared land for gardens. Population grew. The forest shrank. Birds disappeared. Soil eroded. Finally, sometime before Europeans arrived in 1722, the last tree fell. Without wood for canoes, fishing declined. Without trees to hold soil and moisture, agriculture faltered. Famine followed. People starved, fought, and even turned to cannibalism. They toppled each other's statues in rage. The society collapsed. It is a powerful story, especially for a world worried about climate change and resource depletion. Rapa Nui becomes a miniature Earth, a moral lesson carved into the Pacific. If you cut down the last tree, you doom yourselves. But like so many neat parables, the closer scholars look, the messier it gets. The ecocide narrative, as it's often called, rests on real evidence. Pollen cores from lake sediments and peat bogs show that Rapa Nui was once forested, dominated by a species of giant palm. Over centuries, that pollen signature declines. Charcoal traces increase, suggesting burning. Seeds and rat-gnawed nutshells appear, hinting at invasive rodents. By the time Europeans arrive, the forest is gone. Archaeologists find signs of soil erosion and intensification, stone mulching, rock gardens, complex field systems built to squeeze more productivity from degraded land. They find fortifications, obsidian spear points, skeletons with trauma. Oral traditions recorded from islanders speak of warfare between clans, of a shift from statue cults to a birdman cult focused on competition and ritualized violence. All of that fits a story of stress and conflict. But there are complications. One is timing. Forest decline seems to unfold gradually over centuries, not in a single catastrophic lurch. The last palms may have vanished only a few hundred years before European contact, or perhaps overlapped with it. And while deforestation clearly happened, the reasons are not as simple as people cut too many trees for moving statues. Rats, likely arriving with the first canoes, may have played a major role. Gnaw marks on seeds show they were consuming palm nuts in huge numbers. In island ecosystems, rats can prevent tree regeneration almost entirely. Even with moderate human use, forests can fail to recover if every seed is eaten. In this view, the disaster is not purely local mismanagement, but the unintended consequence of a biological invasion. Climate adds another layer. Tree rings and broader Pacific records hint at periods of heightened climate variability in the last millennium. Stronger El Niño southern oscillation patterns, more frequent droughts. On a tiny island with limited fresh water and thin soils, mild shifts in rainfall can cascade into major agricultural stress. People might respond with increased terracing, mulching, and ritual activity, exactly the kinds of things we see in the archaeological record. Then there is European contact. When Dutch, then Spanish, and later British ships arrive in the 18th and early 19th centuries, they bring diseases, violence, slave raids. Missionary accounts and later censuses record a population crash from several thousand to barely over 100 by the late 1800s. Many moai are already toppled by the time detailed records are kept. Fields are trampled by introduced livestock. Traditional authority structures are disrupted. Some researchers argue that what earlier scholars labelled as prehistoric collapse is, at least in part, the result of this colonial maelstrom. Oral histories collected from Rapa Nui elders often place major upheavals, statue topplings, and social transformations within the era of contact and its aftermath, not in some distant, isolated past. So we end up with multiple pressures operating at different timescales. Long-term forest decline, pushed by human land use and rats. Periodic climate stress. Local conflict between clans competing for prestige and resources. And then, suddenly, an external shock. Disease, enslavement, imposed land use changes. Each line of evidence highlights a different piece. Pollen cores sketch the broad outline of environmental change, but cannot tell us who cut which tree or why. Archaeological surveys map house sites, gardens, quarries and platforms, showing that people were still building, farming and organising labour long after the forest was gone. Oral traditions preserve memories of ancestors, rivalries, and sacred places, but they are shaped by centuries of retelling, including under colonial pressure. Even something as iconic as the Moai remains contested territory. How were they moved? Older models that imagined huge tree roller systems assume a level of timber use that might not match the late deforested landscape. Recent experiments suggest statues could be walked upright with ropes and coordinated teams, needing less wood than once thought. If so, the Moai building tradition may not have been the straightforward engine of ecological ruin that the classic story claimed. Were the toppled Moai signs of total breakdown, or of political and religious change, as new cults supplanted old ones in a world already reeling from outside forces? The answers are still being argued. Underneath those arguments is a deeper issue: the risk of projecting our own fears and morals onto other people's past. In the late 20th century, at a time when environmental concerns were entering public consciousness, Rapa Nui became a ready-made allegory. An isolated island, limited resources, a society that refused to change course until it collapsed. The story fit neatly into books and lectures about modern sustainability. But the past does not exist to provide us with neat warnings. The islanders of Rapa Nui were not caricatures of short-sighted consumers. They were skilled navigators who found one of the most remote places on Earth. They engineered intricate agricultural systems to cope with poor soils. They carved, moved and raised multi-ton statues with stone tools and human muscle. They adjusted, reorganized, persisted. Their history includes missteps and conflict, yes, but also ingenuity and resilience in the face of forces, ecological, climatic, colonial, that no one community could fully control. As new methods refine dates, map ancient fields in more detail, and extract more information from lake mud and buried charcoal, our narrative of Rapa Nui keeps shifting. The morality play of simple ecocide gives way to a more complex drama, one where environmental change, invasive species, social choices, and outside violence all have roles, and where the final act is not a neat ending, but a living community still there, still telling its own stories. And that, in the end, is one of the recurring themes of these lost and partial epochs. The more precisely we can measure, the more clearly we can see. But what we see is not a single settled script, handed down from on high. It is a set of evolving interpretations, tested against new evidence, checked against the memories of those whose ancestors lived through the changes. History, even on a tiny island in the middle of the Pacific, is not a finished monument. It is a conversation between stones and pollen grains, between bones and stories, between our present anxieties and the stubborn, complicated realities of the past. If you trace your way back through this whole journey we've taken tonight, a pattern starts to emerge, from the near extinction of early humans in a climate crisis, almost 1 million years ago, to mysterious stone circles at Göbekli Tepe, to cities that kept accounts on clay and then misplaced half their tablets, to vanished archives in Carthage and Alexandria, to the contested stories of Rapa Nui. Again and again, history shows up not as a clean, continuous line, but as a patchwork, bright squares of survival, and long, dark seams of silence. Some of those silences are prehistorical, tens or hundreds of thousands of years, where we can only glimpse people through stone tools, bones, and the faintest genetic echoes, like the bottleneck survivors who gave rise to Neanderthals, Denisovans, and us. Some belong to literate worlds that wrote constantly, but left us scripts we still can't read, like the Indus signs or Linear A. Their streets and drains and temples survive, but their voices are locked away behind undeciphered symbols. Some gaps open suddenly at moments of collapse. The late Bronze Age, when palaces burned and regional trade networks snapped. The classic Maya, when royal monuments stopped being carved and cities emptied. In both cases, we see the before and after more clearly than the long, messy middle. Others are made of documents that once existed and then quietly vanished. Mesopotamian ledgers washed into the Tigris, early Egyptian annals that crumbled, Carthaginian histories burned, shelves of scrolls in Alexandria dispersed by mould, fire, neglect, and time. Rome's 3rd century crises filtered through a handful of confused chronicles. Different kinds of gaps, but they all do the same thing. They limit how certain we can ever be about exactly what happened and why. That can feel unsettling. We like clear stories, sharp heroes and villains, exact dates, tidy causes. But the honest answer over and over is that the evidence allows several possible stories, not just one. Maybe the first city in a region rose slowly through centuries of trade and incremental change. Or maybe there was a more abrupt revolutionary shift we just haven't found yet. Maybe an empire fell mainly because of drought, or mainly because of war, or mainly because of internal politics. Often the surviving traces are compatible with all three, in different proportions. Living with that uncertainty doesn't mean giving up on understanding. It means accepting that the past is a set of models we keep revising, not a finished script revealed once and for all. And those models do change. New digs expose layers no one expected. Improved dating methods tighten or rearrange timelines. A single inscription pulled out of the ground in some quiet valley suddenly clarifies a whole dynasty. A breakthrough in decipherment can turn rows of meaningless marks into laws, songs, and letters from people who worried and loved and argued, just as we do. The gaps are not fixed. They breathe, a little wider, a little narrower, as new evidence appears. You can think of the present as one more future excavation layer. If some distant archaeologist, tens of thousands of years from now, were to sift through our ruins, what would they see? Concrete, glass, plastic, steel? Maybe a few preserved hard drives, maybe not. Pollen from our crops, bones from our livestock, landfills like artificial rock formations, a strange chemical signature in ice and sediments from our industry. What would they miss? The jokes, the languages that never get written down. Most of the music, most of the stories, most of the quiet, private moments that never leave a durable trace. The parts of our lives that feel the most real to us may be the least likely to fossilize. Knowing that we can look back at ancient gaps with a little more humility. The people who lived in those dark stretches of the record were not less historical than we are. They simply left different kinds of traces, and most of those traces, wood, cloth, papyrus, skin, breath, sound, have faded away. So, as you drift towards sleep, you might let your mind wander through those missing chapters. Imagine the conversations around fires we'll never hear, the first stories told in languages that left no script, the ordinary days in cities whose names we've lost. And if you'd like to keep wandering through them with me, you can help this kind of slow, careful storytelling continue. If you found this relaxing, or thought-provoking, or both, you might gently tap the like button. If you'd like to hear more journeys into the quieter corners of the past, you can subscribe, so future nights in history find their way back to you. I'd also love to know where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. Are you on a bright morning walk, or lying in the dark, half asleep on the other side of the planet? If you feel like sharing, leave a comment with your place and your moment in time. Those little notes turn this from a one-way whisper into a shared global conversation. History, after all, is not just about what has disappeared. It's about who is here, now, wondering, asking questions, filling the gaps with curiosity instead of certainty. We live surrounded by silences we may never fully solve. But inside those silences are possibilities and room to keep learning, slowly, patiently, as long as we're willing to listen.